And we're back.
Welcome to No Direction, the Pathfinder News, Reviews, and Interviews podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Costello. And normally, I would be joined by Param, but as it happens, he is unavailable tonight. So luckily, our guest was actually a network member, and she is going from the guest to the co-host, and is also producing the episode. So let's all give a big thank you to No Direction's own Vanessa Hoskins.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, because you definitely took on a lot more responsibility than our average guest.
Oh, luckily I was already all set up for it, so, whew.
I mean, yes, that is very lucky, because otherwise I would be handling this, and I handled it one time before, and no one could see us.
Oh, no.
Yeah, could not figure out how to get the camera to stream.
That is much more complicated than you think it should be, so, you know. All right, so what are we talking about today? Adventures, yeah?
Well, let's start by talking about you, because, as I said, you are a member of the No Direction Network, and we like to have everyone on the network kind of work in their wheelhouse. So your column is Craft Adventure. Why is adventure writing your wheelhouse?
It's probably the thing I've done the most, especially with published adventures. I've got 10 out there now and a few in the works. I've been writing adventures and running homebrew campaigns since early college. Back when I was strictly against written modules because I wanted to write my own thing. And now I'm like, oh, no. A lot of times, even if I just want to run a one-shot, I'm going to do a published adventure because it just takes too much time to write my own thing on the fly. But, yeah.
We are definitely going to talk about writing your own thing versus running canned adventures. But
Fantastic.
You mentioned you've got 10 adventure credits to your name. Can you list some of them that people might be familiar with?
Yeah, so the first Paizo credit that I have is from Under Ice. It's a Season 6 adventure that I probably spent 80 hours writing just to make sure it was perfect. I didn't want there to be a chance that Paizo would say, oh, no, thanks, that was a one-off and we're done. But some of the big ones people will know is from the Tome of Righteous Repose, which was the first 3 to 7 evergreen in Pathfinder Society, and also 8-99, which is the Solstice Scar, which is the big, I guess they could end up calling it a modular interactive. Both of those were experimental scenarios to see how things went, and I know from Tome of Righteous Repose was extremely popular and still is today. We learned a lot on Solstice Scar, and that's where I'll start with that one.
Oh, interesting. I remember Solstice Scar running really smoothly on my table.
I think it runs well. There are some bits with the experimental part of it, the modular piece, that I think they would probably do differently if they did it again in, say, Pathfinder 2's Organized Play or in Starfinder.
It felt like before you got involved, there were very few people that wrote specials. So how did you manage to get your name in the hat, and how did you get your name pulled out of that hat to write this one?
That is a great question. I think being able to run that special, or write that special rather, came from our success from the Tome of Righteous Repose. And I have no idea how I got picked for that. Super lucky, I guess. Maybe John and Linda knew that I was just very adventurous as an author and willing to take on something challenging. I know that one, for example, they said we want to do a 3 to 7 evergreen. We don't know what that looks like because they had only done level 1 to 2 evergreens up till that point. And I tackled it ferociously. I remember looking at it and thinking, you know, I've played these evergreens and they're fine. I mean, they're good adventures, they're good stories, but they didn't seem like good evergreens to me. A lot of them had the same sort of, this is the plot, and it goes on the way it usually does. And then the only thing that's changed is, like, what kind of ooze do you fight? You know, what kind of bandits are there? And it was just changing it just a tiny bit. And I thought, I want something where when the players go in there, they have no idea what they're in for. So I wrote Tome as completely modular. Everything changes every time. I think I ended up doing the math, and there were reasonably over 500,000 different iterations that you could run of this.
Wow. And GMs don't hate you for that?
GMs love me for it. One of the things that's in there is they don't have to prep the entire thing. It's suggested, especially when they're first running it, to prep it ahead of time. Each of the sections have anywhere between 10 or 12 different options, and there's a table they can roll on, or they can just choose one, and it says explicitly in there, do whichever you feel comfortable with, and whichever you think would make the best adventure. And that way they can figure it out ahead of time and then bring a unique adventure to the table. And by doing it that way, it creates all sorts of different things that can happen in a multitude of ways. And I think GMs like that freedom, because in organized play up until that point, everything was very, very scripted.
By the way, we've got a pretty active chat, and it's mostly just people fanning over you.
Oh, thanks.
Lost Spears says Solstice Scar was a blast. Bard Waterby says true that. And Lucas says his favorite evergreen scenario ever.
That's good. That's wonderful. I know Lucas is saying that he's actually planning on running at least one table of that over the Extra Life event happening next weekend. So
nice. I can't believe it's next weekend.
I know.
Oh, wow. Cryptwalker has a question. Could someone explain to me what an evergreen is?
Oh, sure. So in organized play, Pathfinder Society specifically, there's a rule that you can only play for credit once and only GM for credit once. So you can GM a scenario as much as you want, but you only get credit one time. And as a player, once you've played that scenario, the idea is you know the story, you know the encounters, and they don't want you to spoil it for other people. So they created these evergreen scenarios that could be played a multitude of times, and generally they have some variation in them. As I said, earlier ones had just different monsters at different points and different types of encounters. Newer ones have really gone the extra mile, including having variation in the plot, where maybe it's a mystery scenario and you have to figure out who's behind it all, and it might be different every time. And so they've really gone the extra mile with that.
So we aren't here specifically to talk about your body of work, although
Sure.
It is an impressive one. Is there anything about or any other adventures that you've written that you're particularly proud of, or that you've got really interesting feedback on?
One of the ones that I'm proud of is actually a Starfinder scenario. There's two, if I can. One of the Starfinder
Sure.
scenarios, Save the Rank Rhodas, that came out, that has just become this Save the Rank Rhoda, movement within Starfinder, which is kind of fun. To save these dinosaurs that are on the verge of extinction, and it's just kind of fun to have been part of that. The other one that wasn't a Paizo product, actually, was called Palace of the Lich Queen. It was published by Savage Mojo, and it was probably one of the first big adventures I got to help write back in 2015. This is actually a Pathfinder adaptation of an existing Savage Worlds product, and they wanted to port it over to a new system. And I remember a friend of mine, Matt Medeiros, got me involved in it, and I was working over there with George Loki Williams. Some people know him. And I remember him saying, okay, well, we have all these encounters, and so just grab one and go, and let me know when you need another one, and I'll give you another one. And I created, I don't know how much, I think 25 full encounters in 10 days, plus all the supporting content for those encounters. And it wasn't just like, oh, I made a stat block and a monster, and here we go. Some of those encounters were multiple fights, because it says encounters, and sometimes it was like a trap and a monster and you're done. And sometimes there was one where it was like, okay, there are 13 floors of traps and monsters, and I'm like, wait, 13 floors of traps and monsters? That's a whole module, that's a whole adventure. How am I going to do that? He's like, you'll figure it out. So in 10 days, we just beat through this as fast as we could, getting it all done, and it was fantastic.
Wow. And you mentioned earlier that the first scenario, your first published adventure, you spent about 80 hours working on.
For Paizo,
most GMs don't have 80 hours a week to work on the adventures they're going to be running that week. So you're here to help people concentrate that 80 hours into some advice that people can apply to their own prep, their own writing. You are here to tell us how to write an adventure, what makes an adventure, regardless of the edition that you're writing. So why don't you get started? What is the basics of an adventure?
Basics of an adventure. I would say that if you're looking to do something for your home game, the first obvious thing is a premise, right? You need a basic plot to go off of. If you're not sure where to start, one of the things I like to do is ask my players, what's your trouble? Like, set it up. You got in trouble with the law a couple years back, and what was it? And have them come up with something. Then you can riff off of that. Sometimes you can say, something tragic happened to one of your family members. What was it? And have them come up with something. But once you have your premise, then you can really start to build around that and go from there.
All right. So let's say that I accidentally caused a leak in the water tower. And I thought I could fix it by just creating water inside, but it ends up creates salt water. And so I got in a lot of trouble for that. Where do we go from here?
From there, I would probably say, okay, so then your character still owes the city some community service, essentially. You owe a debt to the city for all the work they had to do to scrub all the salt water out and purify the aqueducts, and they're gonna cash in on that favor. And maybe this is go pick up a dignitary at another town. They've asked for an escort, and you just have to bring them back. It could be as easy as going and checking on a local village that's maybe under control of that city-state. You have all sorts of options from there.
All right, so that's the premise. Mm-hmm. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand. Mm-hmm. What's the next basic component of an adventure?
It's probably the setting. Chances are you've already got that going into it, but you can really look at the minutiae of the setting. So let's assume that the city gives you an escort quest, right? And that's what you've decided to do. You thought, that'll be fun. I can come up with an NPC. The setting can be all of the land between where you start, where you pick up the NPC, and where you end up. And you can decide, okay, well, what is in there? Is it a forest? What kind of terrain? What interesting things? And that's probably the next thing I would figure out, because that's going to dictate a lot of your other decisions.
Sure, because in the example that I gave, if we were in Varisia, mm-hmm. that's one thing. If we were in Kadira and I ruined the water supply, that is a much more extreme problem.
Oh, yeah, you'd get jailed for that.
I liked community service. Can we stick to community service?
Well, then let's not go to Kadira.
Let's see. Now, setting, again, pretty straightforward. Yeah. It's where you are, where things are happening. Are there any questions you can ask about how to apply a setting to an adventure that would be helpful to a GM?
Sure. So some of the things, I guess you kind of go along with your plot that you're putting together is like, what sorts of obstacles do you want the PCs to face? Obviously, you've already got some social aspect if they're picking up some dignitary on some, escort mission. But if you know you want to highlight a specific monster, right? You just finished painting your shambling mound. Okay, well, we need a place for that shambling mound to exist, and so that can sort of inform what you want your setting to be. Also, other things like, the party wizard has been solving an awful lot of problems with their magic. We're going to send them through a small county that is cracked down on magic users and doesn't want any of it. And that way their magic is maybe not like super illegal, but punishable by, a stiff fine, imprisonment, enough harassment that they'll think twice.
Now let's say we're starting to get a contradiction. So you mentioned I made, the GM has painted up a shambling mound miniature. Mm-hmm. What if we're already stuck with that Kadira setting? Mm. How important is it that the GM justifies outwardly why they are combining two oil and water elements?
I actually think this is pretty important. There's a certain verisimilitude or like believability that you have in an adventure that you could see that these things happened. And yes, it's a fantastical world full of dragons and wizards, and you can't always just say a wizard did it. But you have to have some believability that when you're going along in the desert, all of a sudden there's an oasis and there's a creature, and oh look, now you're fighting a shambling mountain for some reason. How did it get there? And you have to have some sort of story, not only that exists to justify it, but some means for the PCs and therefore the players to discover this information, so they don't just go, why are we walking through the desert and then there was a swampy oasis with a shambling mound? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so a lot of what you're saying, anytime I've encountered a haunt as a player, and especially if we don't have somebody that has positive energy on them, the frustration is that I know that someone has created an interesting backstory for this haunt, and the mechanics do not give me any access to the backstory, and the backstory is how you solve the haunt. And so it's just like, I am being denied interesting information just because of how this encounter is, just the spine of how this encounter is written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can definitely be a problem. And so in that case, I always recommend having at least 3 big clues, 1 or 2 of which are easy to find, that help describe what happened. So if your haunt is that there's someone dead in the bottom of a pit, how do we figure this out? Well, maybe when you find the skeletal corpse down there at the bottom, you can do a heal check and realize that their legs are broken. And you go, okay, that's interesting. They're stuck down there. Okay. Maybe they have a letter that's long since rotted away, but it still has a wax seal that's hardened into, like, a mineralized into a stone, and then it's a wax seal of a royal family or a noble family, and you go, okay, this person was a messenger maybe, or a part of this family, and that way you can start to put together at least something of why this person was here in the bottom of a pit and haunting you.
See, I like that. That sounds like a haunt I could really sink my teeth into, whereas a lot of the time the GM will just be like, let's take a second for me to explain the backstory of this haunt that you just solved. And it's like, how are we supposed to know this?
Yeah, exactly. So I think as an author of a scenario, if you're writing something especially for publication, you need to definitely think about that. And as I said, come up with at least 3 different interesting clues they can find, that even if the PCs don't put together the entire story, they go, well, we know something about this. And sometimes, especially in home games where you're making stuff up, they might really be interested in what happened to this apparent messenger who fell in a pit and broke their legs, and start following up on that. And for homebrew campaigns, those are sometimes the best storylines because your PCs, your players, are already invested. So, yeah, justify everything with a story, and you'll always have plenty of plot threads to follow.
All right. Instead of moving on to the next one, you've brought up an anecdote that I like to, anyway, kind of like a hint.
Okay.
Because that's literally what we were just talking about, how this is a hint that will lead to potentially solving a later aspect of it. Mm-hmm. In the WWE, when Vince McMahon wants to drive something home, he makes sure that it is repeated in the exact same way 3 times by the commentary team. Mm-hmm. So there was, like, if a tag team's breaking up and it's because one guy is just constantly screwing up, and he'll say, like, and now everyone at some point during the segment say it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and that becomes the theme of that segment, and it's like that repetition sticks with you, and it's like that becomes a t-shirtable phrase, and it becomes something that can be referenced back like many matches down the line. Mm-hmm. And so it's like the idea of a repetition of the same clue 3 times makes it stand out as a clue.
Yeah. Exactly. I think that definitely trying to put in those little bits of information for the PCs to find, as you're saying, like repeat it over and over, definitely helps, because they're not always going to make that heal check. They're not always going to make the knowledge and ability to know what this wax thing is. They're not always going to make those checks. And so if you can give them a bunch of different, like, even of the same information over and over, yeah, then if they miss 1 or 2 of them, they'll probably hit a 3rd one. And if they hear it 3 times, they go, okay, this is definitely the story. We have confirmation. Here's all these sources. So that's definitely
this guy's got point. Broken legs. The GM keeps mentioning these broken legs. How oddly specific. What do broken legs mean?
Yeah. Excuse me a second.
Sure. How long of a second? We good?
I lost your audio for a second. 1 second.
Okay, I guess I should be talking to make sure that you can still hear me.
I blame my cat. She's knocking my headphones out.
Oh, yeah. Do you have a bowl? Just put a bowl next to your computer and the cat.
I'm going to switch to big, ugly headphones. Is that better? Let me fix it. Nope, you're fine. Just give me a second. Yes. I need 3 clues.
Well.
All right, how about this?
Yep.
Let's see if they hear you now.
Hey, everybody. I am the very model of a modern Major General.
My cat decided just now to apparently bust my headphone jack. Hey, there we go. You're back. Okay.
Okay, great. So let's give it 3 seconds of silence so that Param has a good edit out point.
Sure.
What were we talking about besides the broken legs?
Besides the broken legs. We were talking about sending home clues to make sure that the players get where the next plot is. And we were also talking about the elements of putting together an adventure. And the next thing I was going to mention is genre.
Okay, so let's give it 3 more seconds of silence so we can cut this part out.
Okay.
And then we'll get into genre. I'll pitch you a question.
Okay.
We've covered premise, we've covered setting. What's next?
The next thing I usually try to figure out is like the genre I'm going to go for. And that's not always obvious. So in this, back to this hypothetical scenario of escorting some dignitary, you can have it be a comedy. Maybe it's dealing with this obnoxious noble and, on the road and they don't have their creature comforts and, you're trying to interact with them. That'd be kind of funny. It could be intrigue. Maybe they're up to something no good and you have to figure out what it is. Or maybe it's horror and everything's going peachy keen until something strange starts making noise in the woods. And those are all very different adventures with the same basic premise.
Yeah, I've played in a couple of different Pathfinder Society scenarios that are escort missions, and one of them was definitely played for comedy, and one of them was played, I would say horror, maybe tragedy, and we played them back to back with the same group. And the fact that they're both escort missions, nobody brought this up. Nobody was like, we're bringing another person from point A to point B. And It really is just how the genre was factored into the adventure that made them feel like completely different adventures.
Yeah. Yeah, it can have a huge impact on your choices once you've settled on a genre.
Come to think of it, that same group has played. We haven't played that many scenarios together, but we also did the sleepwalk of our what's his name? Anyway, it's about basically escorting a sleepwalking PC.
The Night March of Calcomedes.
There we go. That is definitely played for comedy, and it's like madcap comedy. It's very different from the other comedic escort mission we did, and it's really of how much the genre is played up.
Lost Fear says that you can make any escort a comedy.
I feel like I'm being accused of something. I mean, I can make most things a comedy and a tragedy at the same time.
I'm pretty sure it was a compliment,
but specifically.
I'm pretty sure it was a compliment, but yeah.
All right, so that's 3 of the 4 that your article outlines as key elements of an adventure. And I think the last element we're really going to have to distinguish from the one we just went over, and that is theme. So how is theme separate from genre?
Theme, I think, is more of a subtle thing, and if you don't have one, your adventure will do just fine, honestly, but I think it benefits a lot from theme. So themes are usually subtle things like coming of age, or man versus nature, or one of those sorts of things, where in the escort mission case, if you want to do, civilization versus nature, you have this established aristocrat that you're taking. They probably have a fancy carriage, and maybe along the way there's issues like, oh, the bridge is out. Well, you're not going to be able to bring your carriage because there's no bridge, but we can just take the horses and leave the carriage here. Oh, they don't want to. It could just be wild animals and other natural hazards that you're dealing with, and that would be something that would help inform the adventure and what you're dealing with. In a more subtle way, it could also be something like the loss of innocence. And you can send this home not only through a grander way, but also in smaller ways. So along the way, they find they find, say, a child or something, or, you know, a young adult whose family was killed by something wild, or bandits, or whatever it was, and you have that loss of innocence of that person, as well as other places you can fit it in. And usually, once you've decided on a theme, you can go back through your adventure and find little places to sort of highlight it, and it almost becomes just like, for those of you who are painters, like painting the highlights in a miniature. It's just that little finishing touch that just makes it look so much better. And that's what theme can do for you.
My favorite example of theme is the Terminator, the movie, where Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, the T-800, is tracking down Sarah Connor, and every advancement in his search is because of technology. So he finds her address because of a phone book. The only reason phone books exist is because of phones. Then he goes to her house, kills the people that are house sitting instead of her, but then because an answering machine plays her voice message while he's there, he's able to figure out that he killed the wrong person. And it's like, it's several steps of him using technology in a movie about how the future technology is going to take us over. And so that's like, it's what makes an action movie a smart action movie, when there's something, a subtle, smarter layer going on at the same time as, you know, the gunfights and the chase scenes.
Oh, perfect example. Yeah, because if you take that layer away, then it's just a robot killing people, and it's like, it might be exciting action, but it's not interesting.
And it's also something that people that are watching the movie might not even realize is happening. And it just, you leave that movie thinking like, that was better than most movies. I wonder why that felt like more than an average action movie. And it's because of how theme factored into it.
Sure.
And I guess setting, premise, and genre. Yeah, no, that Terminator just hits all cylinders.
Yeah.
I guess it fires on all cylinders. You're not supposed to hit your cylinders.
You really shouldn't hit them. I hear that when they're stuck, sometimes a rubber mallet, but I'm not a car mechanic, so I don't know.
Well, I'm taking your advice next time my car's stuck. I'm just
don't
hitting the cylinders.
Don't do
I'm
that.
not even sure. Do all cars have cylinders? Is this standard, or is that a race car
I take
thing?
no responsibility. No, our cars have cylinders, yeah.
Oh, neat. Well, I will find them and I will smash it.
I mean, you're not going to see them on most cars. They're, like, covered up, but they're in the engine block there somewhere.
All right. Well, I can hit very hard with mallets.
Fantastic. Cryptwalker says, Engineering 101, hit it hard. That's it.
So those are the four factors of... that's like crafting the adventure, but how do you actually get to writing them? How do you include all of these factors into the writing of the adventure?
That writing process is probably going to be different for everyone. I like to do sort of a layered approach. Rather than just plowing through from page 1 to page 720 or however big this thing is. I usually just start the way that my high school English teacher told me, which is to outline. And then I'll sort of go from there. And I think that is by far the best approach. You can really see an overview of all the elements that are going to be in there. You can figure out your pacing. That way you don't have like too much action or too much downtime all at once. So you can really plan the whole thing out. I usually then go through and do a really ugly, rough type of everything, where it's just like, okay, this is it literally, I type things like, this is the scene where they find the obnoxious noble, she's drinking tea. This is the scene where wolves attack. This is the scene where, or something like that. That way I can just have, for me also, the technical aspects, right? I have all my headers, I have all my stuff, so that I have all that done. And then by that time, I've thought about it a lot. And then I can actually sit down and write it and be like, okay, I remember thinking about this particular scene and some elements, and I can really put in some interesting details. I'll do that last, or almost last. The very last thing, other than word count editing and things, would be like that theme we're talking about of, so if I was writing a Starfinder Society scenario that was very similar to Terminator, since that was a great example, one of the last things I would do is say, oh no, instead the next clue is going to be technology-based because we're talking about the evils of technology and how dangerous it can be, so I'm going to change this plot element to fit the theme. And that's that last.
Now, what about your more technical masters, your XP allocation, your treasure?
Oh, a lot of that's also in the outline stage. If you can get that done ahead of time, it'll save you a heck of a lot of rewriting later, because then you already know, hey, okay, I've already figured out, even if you don't know exactly what creatures are in there, if you know that this is a CR8 fight, then you have your experience budget for that fight.
And what if the fight can be circumvented by clever play? Like, not even that you sneak past the sleeping dragon, but that you find a way around the dragon cave entirely. How does that affect you as the adventure writer who's just supplying something ultimately for a GM to use, but then that GM is going to be short a big chunk of the XP it's supposed to have budgeted?
Sure. Couple ways to do that. One way that I haven't had to deal with too much in society because that's all static, but one way I might do that is to include quest experience, certainly. So it's like, okay, once you finally get that noble to their destination, assuming that they're alive, you get some experience. Things like that. And also a little bit of over budgeting, but not too much. So if you're aiming for a certain amount, try to put maybe 110% of that amount, 115% of the of experience. Figure it out so that if they miss one encounter or even two, that they're still hitting your mark. Because if you're a little over, that's usually not a big deal.
And then what about treasure? Because treasure, like, XP is XP, but treasure can be pile of gold, very specific item that is both X and half of X, depending on how useful it is to the party as far as its value. How do you manage that? Just the multitude of ways that can go, or scrolls, something that a spellcaster could expend, and therefore you're getting less treasure.
Again, speculating at the beginning is the best way to do it. GMs usually know, though, that if their players miss a big chunk of treasure, right? Because they were supposed to defeat the dragon and get the dragon's hoard, and then that is where they get this plot point. But they basically figured it out on their own, assumed it was true, and are moving on as if it's true, so they kind of don't need to go there. What else can I do? And usually that's going to be a GM adjustment side. But for me, I think a lot of it is also... so one of the things I'll do when I outline a larger adventure is I'll put it like in Excel or some spreadsheet program, and I'll have each of the different scenes, and then I'll have a column for the different creatures, and I'll have a column for all the different treasure. And then I can really see exactly how I'm parceling everything out so that it's even. And that way they don't miss one thing as a quarter of the treasure in the adventure. They miss one thing and it's 10%.
I'm just going to take a second to welcome everyone in chat. We just had an influx of new people joining us in chat. Tonight we are talking about adventures, adventure writing, adventure crafting with Vanessa Hoskins, who is a bit of an expert on the subject, and I will not let you correct me, Vanessa. If you have any questions or any even like nagging specific things about adventures you're trying to write or things you've seen in adventures, published adventures that confuse you, ask away in chat. I will try and get them to Vanessa and include them into the conversation. If you are listening to this at home and you're wondering what we're talking about, every other Wednesday, we record a live episode of No Direction, and actually it alternates with No Direction Beyond. So anytime on a Wednesday from 9 o'clock Eastern on, you can go to twitch.tv/No Direction, and you will find a lovely gaming conversation going on between some enthusiasts and some experts and our awesome audience who is adding to the whole conversation every week. All right, Vanessa, I'm going to get super nitpicky.
Oh, no.
At a certain level, usually about, let's say, 6th or 7th level, PCs can fly.
Yes.
One of the most common questions I get as a GM is, how high are the ceilings? Adventures do not suddenly start adding more information about ceilings at around 7th level, and it frustrates me because it's like everyone's flying.
Yep. I would say that that is an author mistake or issue. Typically, because I forget to write them too, so I'm guilty. You can look through my scenarios, you'll see things where I didn't put how tall things were, but I try to remember that every time, if it's an interior especially, I want to go back, and usually at the very beginning, I want to put, here's what the light level is, here's how high the ceilings are unless I say otherwise, and just open with that. If there's a bunch of doors, I'll even say all of the doors are high-quality doors, or all the doors are whatever. That way, the GM says, okay, for this dungeon, for this area, this is the default. And then in specific rooms, you say, but this ceiling is 30 feet high because it's the grand hall. Oh, okay, fine.
And what about when it comes to box text? I'm always surprised that not every room just gets a box text description. So what is the philosophy between which rooms get the description and not, and what are some of the tips to writing compelling, memorable box text?
Compelling, memorable box text. So any room that you really want to draw attention to, box text is the way to do that. So if we assume you have a dungeon that has twice as many rooms or something as have extremely interesting things, But you don't want there to not be a kitchen. You don't want there to, in this fortress, let's say, you don't want there to not be barracks, but there's no fights there. Don't include box text in those less interesting rooms. It's a signal to the GM and to the players that, oh, you're in the kitchen and there's kitchen stuff here, and it doesn't have to have box text. Box text will also help set up the feeling for that room, and so if you're going along the fortress and it's empty and that's creepy, okay, but then the box text can really set the tone for a specific room where there's a fire flickering from a torch that's landed on the, in the south end of the chamber and is casting shadows or something like that. And then all of a sudden you get this really creepy vibe, and that's what box text is fantastic for. In terms of writing it, one of the things I always think of is try to engage at least one, if not two other senses besides sight. So, does it smell different? Do you hear something when you're in that room? Like, is there a constant sound of some sort? Or absence of sound? Always try to think of the other things. Maybe there's something weird in the air that, has this tinny taste that you feel on the back of your, throat. Something you can put in there that really transports the players to that room.
I'm glad you brought up the other senses, because I remember Wolfgang Bauer in a seminar saying when you're describing a room, don't stick to sight. The things that will stand out are the things that are less obvious, and that is smells and tastes if you can fit it in. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad that you've come to the same conclusion, or maybe you also were at that seminar. I
was not, but I took a creative writing class in college by Shelba Robeson, and she always said, if you're describing anything, it always has to have something besides sight. You can tell us what it looks like, and one other thing at least. And that way it really paints a picture.
Speaking of painting a picture, the vocabulary you might usually use in a fantasy setting, mm-hmm. or I guess any setting, tends to also have mechanical impacts. Like, mm-hmm. you can't just describe something as, I can't think of an example right now, but there's a very good chance that you've just listed a feat or a spell or some other option that's already in the game. So how do you make your descriptions compelling without making it imply mechanics that imply mechanics that are not related to what you actually want to say?
Yeah, after 10 years of gaming books, that is becoming more and more difficult, because you can't say that that's a vicious weapon, because that's a mechanical property. But, you can try and sometimes use imagery that suggests it's vicious, right? It's a long sword with spikes on the back of the hilt or something, and you think, oh, that's nasty. Or that there's one side that's not bladed, but it's jagged, and you're like, oh, what is that? Well, it's a wounding sword, but you don't want to say, and he's got a +1 wounding sword. You go, no, it's got like serrated jags on it, and you go, oh, okay. So you can do things like that, but yeah, it is becoming more difficult. The other way, I think, is sometimes I honestly just have to search things.
Fair.
I'm like, it's resplendent armor. Wait, is resplendent a property? Hold on, let me go on to like Archives of Nethys or something and look for resplendent. Is that a game? Okay, all right.
Is it?
I don't know.
It's not.
I think it's not.
You've got me curious. Somebody in chat, if you've got a minute, can you look up resplendent armor? See if that's actually an armor quality.
So.
All right, I've been at the wheel for this for a while. Are there any anecdotes, tips, things that you'd like to cover that you haven't yet? We're not done, just to make that clear. What? But if there's something that you've come across and you're like, oh, I hope we could talk about this. Anything like that come to mind?
Sure. I find that oftentimes it's the little details that make an adventure really stand out. It doesn't have to be the big obvious things. So you mentioned also like in box text, instead of just describing the room, what are a couple attributes about the room that give it more flavor, more interest, other than just here's where the doors are and the floor is made of stone. You can talk about a blood splatter or scratches on the floor or something like that. Same with every aspect. Just add these little flourishes and all of a sudden everything stands out. If an NPC has a book of poetry, that makes that NPC so much more interesting, because now the GM can look and say, this is just supposed to be like a named house guard or something, and they have a book of poetry in their inventory, and now they can use that and be like, oh yeah, you catch the guard flipping through this book. Well, what's the book? Oh, it looks like it's a book of poems. Well, now I want to go talk to this guard. And so little things like that can really flavor the world.
Or as BB Wolf mentions in chat, now they're asking about the poet. Maybe they want you to recite some of the poetry. And I bet that the adventure did not supply the GM with answers to all those questions. Vanessa.
Well, I usually put something instead of book of poetry. You could put like book of halfling limericks or something, and it's, it's enough that you're like, okay, so this guard's a prankster, or, has a good sense of humor. But it just adds a little more personality to everything. Oh, and every NPC should always have a dagger.
Okay, why?
That is just my rule.
All right. They got a ranged weapon. They always, all right. I like this rule.
They're a ranged weapon. They're a melee weapon. They're a light weapon, just in case you get engulfed or swallowed whole. In a fantasy world, you always need to cut things like rope or shackles or vines, assassin vines that are trying to entangle you. There's always something you can do with a dagger. So I try to include at least one on every stat block. Sometimes it gets developed out for some reason, but always include one.
There's one, this isn't my story, but it's something that happened in Hell's Rebels. Someone edited out a big crossbow. What are they called?
Like a ballista?
Yeah. So there must have been a ballista at some point in a dungeon. Okay. Because there is a room full of ballista ammunition, and all of the guards have exotic weapon proficiency ballista, but there's no ballista in the entire adventure, or at least in the entire dungeon. And just like when we came across this ballista ammunition, we were all talking about like, haven't we seen all the rooms? What ballista? And the GM was like, they're even proficient with the ballista. I don't know what happened.
That's fantastic. That reminds
I don't
me
know if
of...
it was development or the author meant to but forgot.
It reminds me of another thing where actually in Tome I was talking about all the different things you can have in there, and for flavor there's this old armory, and I put that there was an unassembled ballista just sitting there. And half the time I run it, if I mention that, players are like, well, how do we build it? Would we? I'm like, I don't craft arms and armor. Knowledge engineering would probably work. Okay, we're going to build this ballista, and we're going to set it up here, and then we're going to try to pull all the bad guys and lure them back into this hallway so we can shoot them with a ballista. And I'm like, okay, I just put that in there for flavor, but sure.
Yeah, no, I would have done exactly what they just did. I know that if you give me any scenery piece to interact with, I will interact the hell out of it.
Oh, absolutely.
We've got some interesting things from chat I don't want to let go. Dungeon Novice says that, so it was BB Wolf that was talking about they want to know about the pullet and the like specifics about the poetry. And Dungeon Novice says those are some of the reasons I don't play with my roommate much.
Oh, no.
So I guess the roommate is just the kind of player that asks all the wrong questions and derails based on a detail. So Bard Wannabe updates that there is no resplendent armor in Archives of Nethys, but there is the Resplendent Mansion, which is a spell.
Okay.
And
well, see, then I can call armor resplendent, and I can't get in trouble for it until the next Splat book comes out.
A Little Muffin says a dagger can always be used to cut your sandwich in half.
It can.
Which, again, Dungeon Novice says that cut sandwiches taste better, even if you plan on eating the whole thing.
Certainly easy to get your mouth around at some points.
And then finally, Russ Brown says the guards dare to dream of the day they get their own ballista.
They dare to dream. Darn it, there was a ballista here before, but tax cuts. I'll tell you what. Just can't afford the upkeep.
Are you paying taxes on? Is it a rented ballista? Is that the problem?
Can't afford the upkeep anymore. You got to keep the gears oiled and the wood polished, and they can't afford that.
It would be great if, like, 2 books later, there's a dragon that just carries around a ballista like a crossbow, and the backstory is he swooped down and just picked up a ballista on a guard tower.
Yes. Oh, that's great. Hold on. Let me write this down. Dragon steals ballista. Fantastic. So I'm not the only author on this stream. You have also written not only a society scenarios, but I understand that you write quite a bit of home games.
Yes. So I've written the society scenario. I have also written the adventure that's in the Looking for Group box, which we might bring up in a little bit because there's something. Actually, can we take a minute to talk about that then?
Yeah, sure.
Because the cool thing about the adventure in the Looking for Group RPG box set I put together is that there's a timeline. Effectively, there's five scenes, 5 settings that you can go to in the adventure. You start at one, and then you have the choice of the other 4. And there's a timeline going all the way through that it's like, if you go to this one first, it will most likely take this time, so this is what you'll find there. But if you go there second, then there's less. So like if you go to the keep first, fully armed and operational. If you go to the keep third, then you've missed it. The bad guys have gotten that, like they're done their planning, and now they've moved on to the dam. And you screwed up. There's nothing that you can interact with anymore. And so that's just like, I've been complimented on that being clever, but that just feels supernatural, not supernatural. It feels obvious to me that there should be a timeline and that it shouldn't just be bad guys waiting in a room for the players to interact with the door and that wakes them up. It should be they have a plan. Their plan has a timeline that they don't think the players will be interacting with, and you just stumble across or are actively conspiring against their plans, possibly to their knowledge, possibly not. And so the idea that all adventures don't have a timeline is strange to me.
Well, yes, and I do like adventures with timelines when they make sense. So there's occasionally the issue where this scene is only interesting if certain events happen at a certain time. And those, hey, guess what? The PCs always show up in the nick of time. That's just how the PCs roll. It's their story. They're the heroes. But there's definitely times like that where if the PCs are making noise, the guards are going to start to prepare. Here's their plan. Here's what they're going to do. And here's how long it takes. That way, as a GM, you can try to figure out, oh, they took, 15 rounds or, however long I thought it was to get over there. Oh, yeah, the guards are super prepared. Versus, oh, they snuck up on them. So, yeah, having those timelines can, I think, enhance it I think only if the PCs are aware that there are other things happening in the background.
So that's also one of the reasons I like having a timeline is because things will go off. So if something hasn't been obvious, if they don't know exactly where the bad guys are going to strike next, something will happen because the bad guys are on their way to something else, and that will alert the players and allow them to catch up instead of just the bad guys are waiting in the background for the players to sit back, and if they're stumped and the world is waiting for them to act and the players don't know what to act next, the timeline is there to actually help you by saying like, well, you didn't get to the bank in time, and so it was blown up and robbed, and now the bad guys have all these other resources, and then the next time you encounter the bad guys, they are decked out in cool magic items that they couldn't have afforded otherwise.
Right. Yeah, I think you can definitely do that. I think mechanically, from a storytelling perspective, though, the players need to have some awareness, even if that's such a thing that, all right, so we have the information that they're going to rob someplace in the city, but we don't know where, and it's going to happen today. But you need to figure it out, because if you're not there to stop them, or you don't stop them before then, that's big trouble. And now the players know there's a timeline, right? They know there's something going on. I think that'll increase the tension and really make that interesting, versus just like, I don't know, we're looking for the Brimstone gang, and good luck with that. And they're like, all right, well, cool. Well, we'll just gather information for 4 days. And, oh, what, they robbed a bank? Oh, I was still crafting potions of invisibility. I don't know.
So, yes, usually if there is a timeline, you have to have some indication that time is of the essence. You can't just Batman your way through all the encounters by preparing for an infinite amount of time. But I guess that also, like, the reason that ended up in my scenario, or not my scenario, the adventure that I wrote, is because that's very much how I GM. That I always think of the world first, and then the players are interacting with the world. I'm not crafting the world for the players, and I'm not even thinking too much of this is the adventure. It's just this is a vibrant setting that the players are a part of. When they do something, it interacts to them. There's a plot going on here that interacts with the world as well, and the players are then reacting. It's all about reactions. It's if the bad guy needs this much gold to execute this plan, then then his minions are going to go off and try and rob that bank or whatever. And if the PCs catch on to it early, then suddenly the bad guy doesn't have enough gold and he needs a backup plan. And he's also got these nemesis that he has to now specifically be interacting with. So now there's assassins that are going after them. Where it's like, it's just always like, and one of the reasons that I don't do canned adventures, I don't run them too often, is just because it can't keep up with the number of reactions that are there. And I feel the need to stick to the words that both I have paid for and that my players are expecting me to, are expecting to interact with. And so it's like, all right, well, this is where I need you to be. So you've reacted this way. Now what do I do to get you to back to where you need to be? And it just feels like a lot of the choices that my players are used to with the way I usually GM, they don't get to make them in the same way. And I have to like craft my players into making choices based on this being a limited number of options rather than the infinite number of options that I could theoretically handle.
Yeah. And I think that actually goes well with what Thorcrawl was saying in chat, is that if there's some known and unknown timelines, and that works out the best. So I definitely agree with their point, because then you can use some as a ticking clock and some as a, these things were happening even though you decided to craft Alchemist Fire for a week. You lost all that time, and now they've been preparing far more than you, So I think that's a good point, having both those. But that is a wonderful flexibility you can have in homebrew games to just sort of really adapt on the fly that you can't do in a written published adventure.
So you went from being the kind of person that wrote your own adventures to someone that writes published adventures, and so you've had that brain shift. Yeah. What were some of the ways that you had to change the way you think and approach adventures based on it being something that had to, fit into a page count and basically be like an art order for a GM that you have no information about and no idea how he's going to interact with that adventure?
Yeah, it was a tough shift. I definitely owe a lot of it to playing in that format for a while and GMing in that format. So way back in the day, I was, writing a lot of my own adventures, and organized play came along, and I actually played that for several years, for maybe 3-4 years before getting a chance to write for it. And so by the time it came around, I was used to the format. But that first year of trying to GM for organized play, when I was used to running my own stuff, was just like, they asked what the DC of this lock is. I don't know where it is. Let me, is it in here? And I'm flipping around. Now I just realized it's like, oh yeah, you're going to pick a lock, go ahead and roll. 28. Yeah, that's pretty good. Sure, yeah, you opened it. And you just sort of roll with it. But writing in that format is also, just to sort of go back to your question, you really have to start to think about what are the, let's say, 3 most obvious things you think players will do, right? So there's a locked chest. They're going to bash it open, they're going to pick the lock, or they're going to somehow magic and figure out what's inside. And you just have to try to figure out, like, how can I answer those questions for the GM that's running it, and how can I solve those 2 or 3 most obvious solutions? And then the rest, as long as you've provided enough overall information, it's that's in the realm of, unfortunately, the GM having to guess, because you can't write for every single possibility. It's impossible.
Player spending 2 hours convinced it's a mimic and not interacting with the chest, or waiting for it to waiting for the mimic's tell.
I don't know. I don't know anything about mimics.
You say that like someone who does know a thing or two about mimics.
So, in one of my published adventures, there's a mimic, and I won't say which one, but it went over both very well and very bloody. I think the body count is really high on that one, and I feel a little bad about it, but only a little bit.
No, you should feel bad.
Oh.
No, all right. It's an ambush creature. If it's a high body count, it just means the creature's doing what it's designed to do.
I just made sure the mimic wasn't a treasure chest. That's the only hint you guys get.
Oh, man. If you read the description of the mimic, which I'm sure you have, mimics can be so many things. Like, I think even one of the examples is a mimic can be a door. And I'm just like, why isn't that every mimic? Because, like, people aren't even going to, like, carefully walk up to door, or maybe they would because it's trapped as a treasure chest, but still it just feels like, yeah, all right, it's a door, and the door is eating you alive now. It's just, it seems like so much
that would make a really good mimic.
Trap.
Yeah, that would make a really good mimic, because you're going to search the door, you're going to check if it's unlocked, maybe listen at the door, get your ear stuck.
This isn't necessarily adventure writing, but one thing, actually, I guess. Okay.
Everything is adventure writing.
Right. So in Monsters of Sin, which is a book that Kobold Press released that I wrote, one of the greed monsters was effectively it's the mimic tadpole, where when mimics are babies, they are treasure maps that lead back to their parents. Mm-hmm. And so it just becomes a whole adventure in one, where it's like you find what you think is a treasure map, you go, you find the treasure chest, and now the treasure chest and the treasure map both turn on you, and it becomes a whole new version of the mimic encounter.
Oh, gosh.
And a lot of the time when I design monsters, I think, how are you going to interact with them? How could this be an adventure? I actually think more about adventure writing when I'm writing monsters than I do when I'm writing adventures.
I can see that. And if you're writing really good monsters, they should inspire you to want to write adventures, so that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I was actually listening to a really old Private Sanctuary the other day, and I remember Alex and Anthony talking about, like, that's the best way to write monsters, is you give them a cool story, and then you figure out the mechanics later. And I'm like, yeah, everything has a good story, and if there's a good story behind it, everything is better. Whether that's a class archetype or a spell or anything, it's going to be better.
Something that's going to be in my next Behind the Screens, I've already started writing it, is picking a specific emotion that you want to convey and changing your mechanics to meet that. So if you want to frustrate a player, then you just have this chaotic monster and you just have him with variable AC. And so you've got the player that's like, all right, I hit him with AC 21, so now I know I can power attack or do all these other things. And then the next round it's like, oh yeah, your 21 missed this time. And it's not even under the creature's control. He's just got variable shape.
That's
and another idea was that, like, when you're attacking a specific, like a jewel golem or something, I haven't fully realized the example yet, but basically when you chip away at this jewel golem, chunks of treasure land, and it's like something where the person that interacts with the treasure absorbs it, and they are the only person that gets this gold. And so as you're fighting this monster that's threatening the whole party, you're also kind of watching where the jewels are landing and thinking, like, maybe I can just walk over to that one. Just we're eventually going to split this evenly. So why you don't? Maybe it should be me.
I was thinking that you were going to say that depending on how they fight the jeweled golem is how much treasure they get. Because if they use like an earthbreaker, they're smashing gems right and left. They're going to have a bunch of gem dust, and that's not nearly as valuable as whole big gems. But if they use piercing weapons, well, that doesn't hardly damage it at all.
They're effectively attacking the treasure rank of that monster.
Yep.
So like then
you get your big barbarian with the earthbreaker going, guys, do I want to fight this? I don't want to destroy all our treasure.
I mean, that's basically anytime you're adventuring with the Sunder Specialist. Everyone just hates the Sunder Specialist. It's like, I don't care if you broke that NPC's last dagger. We could have used that dagger. I have sandwiches to cut.
Sandwiches to cut. Yeah, you better have a wizard with make whole.
You can turn the gem golem into diamond dust for the resurrection spell you're going to need.
Yes, you're definitely going to need that. Fantastic. There's one question that I didn't want to lose. It was from Dungeon Novice, was asking about the difference between writing adventure paths or modules or scenarios. Now, I don't have any adventure path, at least through Paizo credit yet. Paizo. But I would imagine, I've written quests and things which are super small, and then scenarios which are much bigger, and the interactive special, which is bigger in sort of another dimension. And really the difference is how much planning goes into it. And that outlining process is just super important. So if I'm writing a quest, it's like a skill check in an encounter, and I can probably just do that in my head and skip outlining for the most part. For a scenario, like, it's important to outline, make sure it's all in there. But for like a long adventure, and I've done some homebrew ones that are long, you have to really figure out everything ahead of time. And a whole adventure path chapter would be even more so. You'd really want to make sure, like, you're not repeating environments too much, types of enemies too much, things like that, to really vary it. And in a way, even though it's a much bigger body of work you have to write with, you have a lot more opportunities to get all that variation in there. So I like to look at it that way.
I also feel like when you're running an adventure path, you can more safely assume it's going to be a balanced party, because you're going to be writing the adventure for a whole group of familiar players with each other that probably discussed what's going into the party. Whereas when you're writing a scenario, I mean, if you've got a locked door and it's an entire party of clerics, that's it. That's it. The adventure's over. They cannot get through that locked door. Their god will not help them.
Yeah, that's tough. And that's definitely one of those things where writing for like an organized play situation, your writing is definitely going to be different, as you said, because of the party makeup. That's a good point. You're going to have to make sure there's not just a key hanging around somewhere, but maybe also a side passage or something.
Is there another rule of three? You try to make sure there's 3 ways to solve every situation?
Mm-hmm. That's a good rule of 3. Yep. Because occasionally, especially in investigation scenarios, you'll want not only for there to be rule of 3 in terms of different ways to find a similar clue, but different checks that are required to get it, and sometimes very different checks for the same thing. So you might want to tell there's someone coming to give you a secret tip, and you might be able to figure out with a linguistics check that they have a slight accent, and so they're more likely to be from a certain group of people or from a certain country, and you're like, oh, maybe they're from that embassy because that was one of our suspects. But you also might want to have it just be a bluff check where you can trick them into giving up their allegiance. And those are an int versus a charisma check. And then finally, maybe a perception check to catch a glint of emerald or something on a brooch under their cloak. And you go, emeralds are used in that, or green, let's say, is used in that sigil. So the emerald might be, part of that noble house. You could go with perception or even knowledge and ability. And that way you've spread the types of checks out as well. It's real important.
Yeah, because that's also something that I've been on the opposite side of, or on the player side of that situation not being handled well. Like, there's an adventure that you get a feather token, a tree feather token, which basically you plant it, becomes a tree. And it was written that it was a low-level adventure, so flying was not an option. And there is one point where you cannot bypass an obstacle unless you plant this tree and climb it. But we got this feather token, thought it was a novelty, and planted it at home right away. And the GM had to find a way to fit another feather token in, another tree feather token, which she played off like, wow, what are the odds? This was random treasure, but you got another tree feather token. And we were like, oh, you know what? If we get like 2 more of these, we could do one at every cardinal point on our lawn. And she's just like, but the adventure was basically forcing her to give us something to overcome, basically an invisible wall that only, no, not an invisible wall, because that's a barrier that you're not supposed to get over. Yeah, it's a hurdle that you're not equipped to jump over without your hand being held, without a boost from the adventure. There we go.
Right. Yeah, you definitely need other ways to get over that wall. Maybe a pit trap in the area, but at the bottom of the pit trap is an adventurer who has a backpack full of climbing gear. Like, I don't know, just something else.
Is he alive? Is he okay?
No, super dead. Super dead adventurer.
Oh, man.
They were there like a month ago.
This adventurer. He had a backpack.
Full of climbing gear.
Yeah.
How ironic that he died in the bottom of a pit trap, but,
Yeah. It was the fall that got him, not the climb.
Always.
So I just want to refresh the 3 rules of 3 we've had so far. One is that if there's a hint, mention it 3 times. One of them is that anytime you're in a situation, or especially a non-combat situation, think of 3 ways the players will approach it and write for that, and then have 3 solutions to any any hard obstacle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I don't like the philosophy that the best way to get over traps and through locked doors is to not have a rogue in the party, because then the GM will just not include that stuff. The world needs locked doors, even if the party doesn't want to play a rogue. Just also give them the window they can climb into, or if it's just a party full of barbarians, they'll dig under it. Actually, in Rise of the Rune Lords, there's a fun example. I've mentioned it a couple of times on the podcast, but we were playing a very warrior heavy party, and we were trying to get to a certain location. And there's the direct path to the location, and then we were taking a boat to go off the direct path, and we got to a wall that we had to climb, and the adventure even says it's a DC 15 climb check, which at first level will probably not be achievable by the majority of parties, but it just so happened our party was super equipped for this thing. So in the face of the adventure, and the adventure even telling the GM not to let us do that, we did it, and we succeeded wonderfully at it.
Awesome. Yeah,
and it's so rare that I see an adventure give advice not to do this, but here's the DC anyway. So it was nice. It was very satisfying.
Yeah, there was one of those in the first Rise of the Rune Lords.
This is what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I didn't want to get too specific because a lot of people will be playing that adventure.
Okay, so it wasn't that one. But there was a whole different thing where there's like a bunch of enemies in an area, like spread throughout this area. But they're like, but once a week on midday on a certain day or whenever it was, they all get together in this one room. But you probably shouldn't make the players fight them all in there because they'll die. And I'm like, well, then, I mean, that's interesting information, but why is that there? If you don't want that to be an option. If you do your
research, you might hear this rumor, and if they're all in that one room, that means this is a perfect time to be in any room but that one room. That's
true. That's true. But man, if you didn't know that, and you're like, this whole place is empty, that's really weird.
Well,
what's
there we
behind
go.
this door?
You should be suspicious that this keep should not be so empty.
Seriously?
Yeah.
What's behind this door? There's a lot of good chanting in here. Yeah.
All the more reason to not go behind that door.
Hope you brought a necklace.
Everything you're saying is, to me as a player, pointing me in other directions.
Hope you brought a necklace of fireballs and you throw the whole thing at once, because it's the only thing that's going to get you out of there.
Do you have to at least pull one off? Because if you throw the necklace, does it still explode, or does it have to be removed from the necklace?
I don't know.
I know if it gets hit by fire, it explodes, but I figure you got to take a bead off, throw the necklace, then throw the bead at the necklace for it to all explode.
Wrap the necklace of fireballs around a bottle of alchemist fire and throw that. And then you have the big explosion.
Actually, in Bone Keep, there's a necklace of fireballs that a monster has swallowed. And when you encounter them, they are tactically lined up that if you have fireball, it is the perfect time to fireball, not realizing you'll set off this necklace of fireballs that then kills the whole party. Which is just a dirty trick, but Bone Keep is all... Yeah, exactly. Bone Keep is known for this. And so it's like... I don't know if it goes into theme, genre. Yeah, I guess theme. The theme is Bone Keep is out to kill you, and so it plays dirty.
Yeah, I'd say that would be a good theme for Bone Keep, is like, this adventure is trying to kill you. That's the theme. Because almost every single room in every single Bone Keep is very unfair. It's so unfair. I'm going to tell a very short anecdote with Bone Keep because it's amazing. When Bone Keep 3 came out, I was running it at Gen Con, and I got a table of random people, and I remember them sitting down, and they're all excited to play, and I'm like, all right, so, I got to write initiative cards, so, who are all your characters? Introduce yourselves. I'm so-and-so. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you right there. I don't want to know your character's name, because I don't want to get attached. Could you just give a general... the Great Sword Fighter? Great, you're a Great Sword Fighter? That's what we're going to call you, Great Sword Fighter. All right, who's... And they're all like... I'm the support bard. Okay, great, support bard. Fantastic. I'm playing pre-gen Kira. Kira, great, glad you could make it. And the whole time there are things that would start to happen and I'd be like, oh, I feel bad about this. Oh, I'm not supposed to feel bad. Okay, I'm trying to fight against it. Okay, I don't feel bad. So roll a fortitude save or you're probably going to have 2 hours free at the end of this slot. That was the most fun table of Bone Keep ever.
And that's, again, knowing how the theme sets expectations so that you knew, like, you would, I assume, not normally GM like that. But you're playing to the theme, you're playing to the expectations. I like it.
Yep. You just got to build it up.
Dungeon Novice says that just got to the point in the podcast listen where we mentioned Bone Keep 3 being announced. That's fun.
Well, go play it. Not with any characters that you really, really love or doesn't have a lot of resources to get back on their feet. Because they're all fun, but they're all hard.
As Dungeon Novice knows, I played through the first 2 Bone Keeps, and the first one I really enjoyed, and I thought it was nice and puzzly. Like, it was hard, and there was definitely some, not unfair, but like exploiting the rules in a way that adventurers usually, like the social contract usually says not to do this.
All right.
And I liked it very much. And then when I played Bone Keep 2, it felt like they were exploiting the rules just to be mean to the players. And so that got me off the Bone Keep train. And so I never played Bone Keep 3.
Yeah, Bone Keep 3 is somewhere
the last
in between.
Bone Keep for a reason?
Yeah, I think so. They also upped the sub-tier a bit, the tiers a bit, so it's a little higher level. They could do some nastier things with it. Without being spoilery, I really like the challenges in there. I feel like they're on the level of Bone Keep 1, where it's like, that's interesting. It's mean, but it's interesting. But it's not quite as well flavored and integrated as Bone Keep 1. The different sections definitely feel like their own mini, I designed this encounter and then put it in this adventure. But they're still interesting, and they're all very different. So,
now, speaking of levels or tiers going up and challenging encounters, Elven Entanglement kind of has a reputation. This is the scenario that I wrote for Pathfinder Society. Has a reputation of having a very hard first encounter.
It does.
Which I was told, like, that is specifically called out in the outline to make this a very hard first encounter.
Oh.
And in fact, any of these scenarios from that season of that level tier basically starts with the same idea of you teleport into an ambush, and it's the hardest encounter of the scenario. And it's having played a lot of that season and seeing that come up multiple times, I was getting used to it and preparing before teleporting. But I was the first one of that trio or cadre of scenarios that play that trick on the players, so people were not expecting it yet.
Yeah.
But anyway, I play tested the fight, and I play tested at the lower tier, and it's like, all right, this works for a full party of 7th level characters. Now let's try it for high tier, which I played it for 9th level characters because that's the lowest you could expect. All right, works out. Not realizing that there could be people playing in the high tier that are still level 7.
Yeah.
And that is a party that cannot handle that encounter. And a lot of the reason that encounter is so deadly, besides GMs playing it with a way that I have issues with, but that specifically, I never play tested it for a mixed group, and it is way too hard for a mixed group to succeed at.
You know, you actually bring up a really good point. When writing these things, if there is a way to interpret it that's just mean or cruel or overly deadly, definitely if you don't want to go for that, write that into the tactics of the monster, write that into the advice, and say, you know what, under no circumstances should this monster with this special power, let's say it's a short-range power, start closer than 60 feet to the PCs. You know?
That is one of the things that in my outline, it started a lot further away, but then a lot of GMs just gave it a surprise round that the players should be surprised because they've teleported in, but this thing was not expecting a bunch of players to teleport in, so you were equally surprised by each other.
Surprised. So no surprise round, and things like that. Like, I have definitely learned to start writing in where possible to be like, oh, don't do it this way. For example, the aforementioned mimic that is so deadly. If I had a chance to do it over again, I would have written it a very robust tactics section that is less deadly. Because when I play it, it's dangerous, but it's not deadly. The mimic does a lot of things to get the players stuck to it before it kills them all, which buys the PCs a bunch of time to kill the thing first, versus just going, oh, I have this ability that does a giant amount of damage. I will just use it every round. It's like, you know, just play with some of the toys. There's toys there for a reason.
Yeah, I put in 3 fail-safes in that encounter. One of them was that it's supposed to start far away, and then in development, it got moved a lot closer. And then 2, I like having encounters where a lot of things are going on. So I'm just going to spoil this encounter because at this point, people either have or haven't played Elven Entanglement. It's not something that people are still playing at cons.
It was 6 seasons ago. It's fine.
Jeez, it was, wasn't it?
Season 4, wasn't it?
No, 5.
So
Day
5
of the Year
seasons
of the
ago.
Demon.
Oh, that's right. 5 seasons. Okay.
Yeah, so the party is going to Keonan. They teleport in looking for a bunch of elves, and look, there's a bunch of elves on a hill. Mm-hmm. And then this giant centipede shows up and starts killing them. And then the elves also start shooting at them.
Yeah, because they don't know. There's just people.
Exactly. So the way the scenario was originally written was that if you convince the elves that, no, we're not crazy demons, this is not another trick, the elves are all exhausted and whatever, and they've just been messed with by the world-ruled corruption of Keonan, that they don't trust anything. But if you can eventually convince them, they will start shooting at the giant centipede.
Right.
So that was the second way of helping the players out. But it ends up, one, people were underestimating just how difficult it would be to talk to the elves, because I set the DC by the rules, and it's like, these are hostile creatures, so you need like a diplomacy check 25 to convince the group not to kill you.
Right. Unless
but at least if you got that 25, the way I wrote it, they would start shooting the centipede. But the way it was published, they would just sit there on their bows, basically, and let you handle the centipede. And it's like they go from being a threat to no help instead of going from a threat to help.
Oh, yeah. That's frustrating.
And then the third thing I factored in was that I said that the centipede's got a trample ability. It tramples one round and then does not trample the next round. The trample is used so that it could then try and eat a creature, so it will always alternate trample, bite, trample, bite. And that's the only thing that it actually made it in, because there's no mechanical reason it shouldn't be trampling every round. There's just a balance reason it shouldn't be doing that. So I found an in-world reason to justify it not doing that. And of the 3 ways to make it not a super deadly encounter, only one of them actually made it in.
Yeah, and Bard Wannabe makes a really good point that normally you can't do diplomacy in combat, so most players aren't thinking, oh, let me try diplomacy to be like, hey, we're over here, we're your friends, we're your allies, don't shoot us. Because they're thinking, well, that takes at least 10 rounds and we'll be dead by then, so I guess we won't do that.
I think I just called it a special diplomacy check to hand wave that.
Sure, but like if the player doesn't know and the GM doesn't tell them, But one thing, you mentioned a lot of things of like you had these safeguards in there and then somehow in development they disappeared and got changed or whatever. And one thing I've definitely learned over writing all these things is if you're working with a developer, use the comment ability that's in most word processors and put that in there and say like, this item is in here specifically to solve this problem, or these tactics are in here specifically because it's far too deadly. You know, through playtest, we found it was far too deadly if the creature starts too close or something like that. And that way, the developer has right in front of them, this is why I wrote this way, and this is the mechanical or story purpose that it serves. And that way, even if they want to change it, they go, oh, okay, you put that in there to do this. I'm going to take that out, but I'm going to put something else in there that should serve the same function. And at least they know sort of where you're going with it.
Now, let's say people are writing an adventure and they're writing it for themselves. They just want to write it like a professional.
Sure.
They don't have the benefit of all this playtesting. So are there any tips for balancing an encounter?
Tips for balancing. Balancing an encounter is a very complicated thing. There's a lot of aspects. I've got a couple blogs about action economy and like one creature versus multiple, but that is one thing to watch out. If you have 6 zombies, they're all staggered, that's only like 6 standards, that's not horrible, but that's getting to the point where that's a lot of attacks against the PCs. You might want to consider 3 advanced zombies, and then, okay, that's only 3 attacks versus them, and balancing it out that way. I usually try to have no more than like +2 or -2 creatures compared to however many creatures the PCs have. So if you've got a party of 4, if that's your assumption, or like you said, a home game, if you have a party of 4, no more than 6 creatures. That's your upper limit. If there is a mechanic where they're calling guards and more people are coming in, great. They show up the round after they defeat one of the guards, another one comes in if they're getting that swarmed. But don't ever have more than that, because otherwise they're just gonna get overwhelmed. And the same thing with minus, because if you've got 6 PCs and 1 big dragon, that dragon's pretty cool, but he only gets 1 shot every round. He needs some support. He needs something else to occupy the PC's time and to balance out that encounter in terms of action economy. So,
and actually, one thing that I like to do is sometimes make the biggest guy in the room actually the weakest. because they will tend to get targeted first. Like anyone that's an obvious threat for non-mechanical reasons and nobody's making their knowledge check, you just give an extra line of description to them, and it's just kind of playing with the player psychology.
It's true. If you can have that Hell Knight or something in full plate with a tower shield and be like, it's a flaming tower shield. What? Yeah, it's just an illusion. It doesn't matter. It doesn't actually do anything. But it's, you know, the sorcerer over there with conceal spell that's really messing up your party. But this big Hell Knight in the middle of the room, they're going to mess you up. You know, they're going to really gather all the target, all the aggro, essentially, all the attention of the players. And it might take them a round or two to realize, okay, someone just charmed their character and someone just, you know, made a web appear that got a bunch of us stuck. What is going on? Before they realize, oh, it's the butler in the back of the room. The butler always did it.
I'll see your Hell Knight with the flaming shield, and I'll raise you that he was the torchbearer and he accidentally set his shield on fire. And so what comes off as cool martial art maneuvers as he's swinging the sword around, or the shield around, is just incompetence. Incompetence done spectacularly well.
That's why you don't want those torch sconces on wooden shields. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? Well,
he's not a very good torchbearer, but he managed to find that Hell Knight armor, so he just commands respect.
So the other thing that was mentioned is, like, in chat, was creature complexity. If you're going to have a bunch of creatures, make them something easy like zombies. Don't make them complex. No one wants to deal with, I've got 4 different wizards to run. Nope. You just win that scenario. I don't want to run that. So definitely mix it up in terms of complexity. So if you've got that one complicated character and a few straightforward characters, that makes it a much easier thing to run.
Are there any, I'm just going to stick to spells, but
Sure.
Are there any options that tend to screw up a lot of plans, and every GM and adventure writer should keep them in mind when they're designing their encounters?
Oh yeah, confusion is number 1. I think confusion and deeper darkness to some extent, are the ones that derail an entire strategy for the PCs. If they lose, even 2 of the party members lose will saves to confusion, all of a sudden that's a very different encounter. Because now you don't only have to deal with the enemies, you have party members who might be beating on each other until one of them dies, and you have to find a way to break them up and stop that. And if you don't have just the right thing to deal with it, it's going to throw it off the rails.
So that's interesting. I was actually looking for common player tactics that, for whatever reason, adventure writers often overlook.
Oh, I see. Probably confusion for the same reason.
Yeah.
Some of the things are like, that's infamous, is sleep hex from a witch. That's another reason that having just one creature on the board is a bad idea, because if they are vulnerable to sleep and you have a sleep hexing witch, that encounter that you thought was going to be a big, major, interesting, exciting fight lasted 1 round and 1 will save, and that was it. So I will try, when possible, to put some sort of save against sleep effects. Dominate effects can also turn the tables very quickly. Even if they're just dominating one of the lower level characters. If you've got like the BBEG and 2 minions, and now it's BBEG and 1 minion, oh, and the other one's on your side, that pretty much cancels out the minion, and now it's party versus BBEG. Guess what? No more speed bumps. And that can turn the tides really fast. So occasionally you definitely want to think about what's available to parties at that level, and I wouldn't say make everything immune, right? Don't do a bunch of mind immune creatures through the adventure, but make sure that the encounters that you want to be big and interesting don't have those major weaknesses.
Thorncull also was mentioning that Obscuring Mist and Entangle, so it sounds like area control spells tend to slow down their games.
Yeah, they can.
And kill the fun.
And both ways, too. We've had games where most of the party is like frontline fighters. They want to get in there and mix it up. You know, they're all melee types anyway. And the wizard or sorcerer or caster of some sort casts web.
Yep.
Why'd you do that? They had a bunch of archers. Well, yeah, now they can't see us. They can't shoot us. But we can't get to them. They're in webs. So you spend 2-3 rounds hacking through web or burning it down just to undo that one spell and get back to what you need to do, which is beating these archers. So.
Now, what about when a player brings an airship to your scenario?
I think there might just be no way around that. If a player drops 50,000 gold pieces on an airship, I mean, you got to give them the win, right?
I guess. That is other feedback I got from Elven Entanglement, where after people took care of this giant centipede, anyone that could raise dead could use it as basically a mount to get through most of the rest of the scenario. And some people were like, so you didn't think of that? And I was like, no, if this is what you are expected to do.
Yeah.
I always say, like, let Aquaman be Aquaman. Don't suddenly find reasons that he can't swim in the water when it becomes a water scenario. Right. Somebody has spec'd a character to do something that's exceptional, and then you are in the situation where the exception is supposed to be an invisible wall. You got to let them have it. You got to reward them for choosing an obscure, semi-focused tactic.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, you can't plan for that. And like you said, if someone brought a pile of onyx with them to raise this colossal scorpion or, colossal centipede up and then ride it around all scenario, they are never going to forget that. That's going to be a gaming story that they tell for years to come. And great. Good. Have fun. Kind of like bringing an airship to a scenario.
Exactly. Airships, giant undead centipedes.
Right.
It's all just... It's adventure life.
For those of you who don't know, Ryan is referring to the fact that I once brought an airship to the Solstice Scar. Spoilers on Solstice Scar, but it is posted in a blog called Storytime, I think. If you want to go check that on the website. It is Pathfinder Society Legend.
And there's pictures, which I very much appreciate, and a very impressive airship miniature.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I made that over, I don't know, maybe a week and 3-4 hours, something like that.
Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. It wasn't as extensive as my Fur Under Ice terrain that I don't have pictures on the site for, but I guess I could post. But remember I told you that was my first Paizo scenario? Yes. Not only did I spend about 80 hours at least writing the thing to make sure it was absolutely as perfect as I could make it. Please, Paizo, please hire me again. But when I was going to Gen Con that year, I was a Tier 1 GM, and I saw that it was on the list of scenarios, and I said, I want to run my scenario as much as possible. And so they gave me 6 or 7 slots of it, and I built full, huge 3D terrain with snow effects and ice effects and everything for the big dungeon section of it. And it was fantastic, because every single time people came up to the table, they're just like, what's under there? I'm like, the terrain, you'll get there. Every time it was revealed, I had people from other tables coming by to look. Oh, that was fun. Again, probably going a bit too far, but I kind of wanted to stand out.
If you're looking for content for another Storytime blog post, that's something I'd very much like to see pictures of.
Okay. All right, I'll have to cook one of those up.
So I think we're kind of winding down here. So I do want to talk about the business side of getting jobs as an adventure writer. What are some of the steps you can take before you are a Paizo adventure writer to both hone your craft and build up your resume?
I would definitely say practice actually writing it. If you want to write for Paizo, write using their spec. You can't publish it that way. It's part of their trade dress. But I think technically it works under there as part of their trade dress if you do it in their exact format. But if you practice writing in that style, in the day when you finally get to write for them, oh, that's so wonderful. When that happens, you'll already be used to it, and it won't be a big hurdle to get over. And if you write scenarios that you can share with other people and sort of get the word out that, like, you know what you're doing, that helps too. The other thing is that when they have the open call, submit to that. That's actually how I got started with Paizo, was through the open call. I posted something. I didn't hear back right away because they were changing internally their development stuff. But finally, John, out of the blue, one day emails me, and he's like, hey, I got your turnover, and make these changes, and send it back to me. And through the language he was using, I could tell, like, he didn't know I was involved in organized play. He didn't know anything about me other than this turnover, and liked it enough to have me, you know, give it back to him. And then he says, okay, well, when I have an adventure come up, I'll have you write one. And it was maybe 6 months or so later that he finally said, okay, I'm ready for you to write this adventure. So definitely do those open calls when they're there. The other thing you can do is if there are third-party publishers that you know of and respect, shoot them an email and say, hey, I see that you have gotten into adventure writing, assuming they publish adventures. But you can say, I see that you do this sort of work, and I really like to write that sort of thing. What do I need to do to become one of your freelance authors? And they'll usually just tell you. A lot of the time it's sample work, but, just asking it goes a long way, honestly.
Now, we are on the cusp of a second edition of Pathfinder.
It's true.
And we don't have those rules yet. So people should probably be, if they're looking for professional publishing credits, especially through Paizo, they should be looking to write for second edition. What can they do now without even knowing how the system works?
Well, the system is definitely going to change a lot, right? We've already seen that through the playtest, so you can't rely that a rule that they have at the beginning, let's say resonance, is going to stay the same, but they can definitely keep an eye on it. When it comes out, especially new systems, I would start writing scenarios and content for it day one. So it releases, read it, think about how you want to write an adventure, and write some fan-made content. Throw it out there into the universe for free, just to get it out there that, hey, I wrote this. Because the writing community in tabletop RPGs is pretty close-knit, and all it takes is, hey, I've got this adventure I threw out there that's pretty good. You show it to a publisher, assuming it's good, they're going to see it and think, okay, this person can write. And then, they're going to be a lot more likely to offer you a job or, to accept your proposal when you say, I've got an adventure for an idea that happens in Midgard, so maybe I can write this. And they might say, okay, we need some Pathfinder 2 authors, sure. Because not all of the Pathfinder 1 authors are necessarily going to be up to speed from day one. There's going to be several of them that are going to say, I'm going to go to my tried and true. Can you write this scenario? And they're like, I honestly haven't read the book. Oh, okay. And they're going to have to go down the list. So you just got to get yourself up to the top of that list.
I think we're about ready to wrap things up, or at least for this segment. Is there any final tips that you wanted to offer?
Playtest, when possible. If you're writing for a publication, playtest. Especially if you're doing something that you think is tricky or cool or innovative. It probably is, but playtest it anyway to make sure it works out the way that you think it will. Because the worst thing is if it looks good on paper and doesn't play well at the table experience is what all the players are going to remember, and that's the feedback your developer is going to get. So if you playtest it, get all the kinks out, and then put it on paper, you'll be a lot better for it.
Excellent. Well, Vanessa, this was an excellent conversation. I'm really excited about it. I just want to write an adventure right now. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, sure.
We do have some news that I'd like to cover. Are you up for, say, 20 minutes of a news segment?
Absolutely.
All right. As we discussed before, I'm actually going to do the transition music live. Oh. And if Param so chooses, he can swap it out for the pre-recorded one.
Okay.
But we will be right back with Pathfinder News right after this. Pathfinder News. Pathfinder News. Pathfinder News. In the Pathfinder News segment, we talk about all the latest happenings from Paizo or third-party publishers for Pathfinder, the role-playing game, the world at large, or, as we're going to talk about later, other products that are referencing the world. But first of all, we should be talking about the latest update for the Pathfinder 2nd Edition playtest, or Playtoost, as Louise told me to call it, because I enjoy that. It's update 1.5 was recently added on the blog, and it's a free download for anyone that's interested. It covers mostly spells. Every single update has had a single feature that they really focus on, and this one is all about spells. It focuses specifically on damage-dealing spells, but it does... wow, ooh, I just lost myself. It does also talk about the non-damage dealing spells and the problems that they will eventually address. It's just, it's too much for the scope of the playtest to address them all now. So they have read the feedback, they acknowledge the problems with the spells, they've upped the damage for the damage dealing spells, and they're going to up the potency for the non-damage dealing spells. Vanessa, have you had a chance to read update 1.5?
I have skimmed it. And it was like, oh, there's a lot to read in here, so I haven't quite gotten through it yet.
I know that you are a lot more active in the playtest than I am. So from your experience, how much is spellcasting an issue in the playtest version of Pathfinder 2nd Edition?
I wouldn't say it was a standout issue for me, but I do know that a lot of people that play far more casters were sort of complaining about how everything balanced out, so we'll see if this solves those problems.
Param makes a specific, because he people know that Param, between he and I, he is the spellcaster of the co-hosts, and he's talking about how they're upping spell damage, which is good because a lot of talk is that spellcasters in the playtest have just been using melee as their preferred tactic.
Yeah.
And I could see how that plays out, because it's like a lot of the complaints is that characters are kind of using the same chassis and that things are a little too balanced.
Yeah.
And so to make the game so that spells are balanced with weapons, which everyone is pretty good at, spells can't be that good, but then weapons are too good because spellcasters are using them. Yeah,
so I'm hoping this makes spellcasting more attractive. I know when we first got into the playtest, looking at some basic things like Ray of Frost does a D8 damage instead of a D3, and I thought, okay, you actually want to use the spell now. That's pretty good. You know, you have something you can go to as like a wizard or a sorcerer and not just have to pull a crossbow out, you know, until you hit level 5 or something. So that was great. But yeah, as you get higher in levels, it's just like, I do almost as much damage as the fighter, and I can do that 3 times a day. Wait, why do I have this profession?
It takes 3 actions to cast most spells, or at least at their most potent, and it takes 1 action to swing your sword.
Right.
And so swinging the sword 3 times, if each swing is as good as 1 spell, why is it taking so much longer to cast your spells?
Sure.
Another issue that came up was that the critical success, critical failure is much more spelled out in spells than it is. Like in combat, 1 is a critical failure, which has no consequence. Also, missing by 10 or more is a critical failure. Again, no consequence. Okay. A lot of spellcasters were finding that people were very often critically succeeding against their spells. And so spells went from having an effect to no effect whatsoever was the most common critical success on a save result. And that was frustrating because it means that they're not even getting a fraction of the cool thing like they used to in first edition.
Yeah.
It's just round after round, they're spending 3 actions to do nothing. And it costs them a resource to do that.
Yeah, and a lot of spells that had great effect in Pathfinder 1 all of a sudden had very little effect in Pathfinder 2, Glitter Dust being a prime example, where in Pathfinder 1, yes, Glitter Dust illuminated invisible creatures, but I'd say that 2 out of 3 times when I see people cast it, it's not to make something, or maybe 3 out of 4, it's not to make something visible, it's to blind people, right? You get the high spell DC, and they're blinded for at least 1 round if they fail. Sure, they get another save every round, but blind is a really bad condition. In Pathfinder 2, it was like, well, if they critically fail, then they're blind for 1 round and that's it. Oh, that's not as good. Okay, I guess it's just for automatically illuminating invisible creatures so that we know where they are, right? Automatically locating them. Well, but if they critically succeed on the save, it doesn't work. And if they save, it only lasts for 1 round. What? Well, it's a terrible spell. I'd rather throw bags of flour at them. Like, what are we doing? So that's one of those things where I'm hoping they address some of those problems, because it seems like they took a lot of those save or suck sort of spells and just went too far. Unfortunately, I see Paizo do this every once in a while, where they take a definite problem in the game and then go too far with it to fix it, or they take 2 different strategies of fixing it and apply both. And so now instead of balancing it nicely, they just made it go from a great option to a horrible option. Like the Jingasa. Like a bunch of examples I could go into. And I think that's what happened with spells. So I'm really happy that they're taking some of those, or that hopefully they will take some of those save or suck spells and make them like useful but not overpowered without being just terrible.
Well, that was part of the philosophy of the playtest, at least how it was written, that here's extreme examples, and then we're going to parse down and we're going to eliminate some huge chunks that we just put in there because it's like, well, we want to playtest just this wacky idea and how it works out. And we have never gotten details on which ones were the wacky ideas and which ones are the main, reflect the main design philosophy of what 2nd edition would be. which is part of the reason that we are seeing a lot of frustration with the playtest. Another thing is that the pace of the playtest is too much for a lot of people, and people are suffering from playtest fatigue.
I definitely have seen this. When the playtest was first released, I asked a few different groups, sort of putting feelers out to see who wanted to play. I ended up in the next week running 3 different editions of Doomsday Dawn Chapter 1. Like, I knew that thing like the back of my hand. Chapter 2, I got one of those groups that could actually get together and do it, and they have just been lagging to get it done because of scheduling and stuff. And here it is, we're in Chapter 6 now. So it's been going so fast, and unless you really have a dedicated group that wants to sit down there and do it every week or every other week, probably every week, because as long as these chapters are, you're not going to keep up. And so that is, I think, a little bit of a problem.
Well, that problem is being addressed. The developers say that they have playtesting goals and need rigorous testing. So, and this is their words, it's going to be less fun than normal gameplay. Something that I don't know if it was not spelled out enough, or if there was so much enthusiasm for the playtest going in that people were ignoring warnings that is a playtest and needs to be treated a little more seriously, and it won't be as fun as you might expect. But anyway, they are definitely saying here it's going to be less fun than normal gameplay. If you don't have time to finish all of Doomsday Dawn, stick to parts 1, 4, and 7. It's perfectly acceptable if playtesting isn't for you and you want to drop out of the playtest.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I do know that one thing that I've been sort of preaching as much as I can to people who will listen is that the playtest is not a preview, it is an experiment. It's not, hey, here's what we're going to release, because if they knew that, they would have just released it. It's, let's play around with all these options and see what you like and don't like. And if you don't like it, that's fine. I think they've been great about responding to people and adjusting with all these updates to try to get the system where they want it to be without, major overhauls, which they can't do in a playtest because they'd have to re-release the whole book. But I think that people's mindsets, unfortunately, I see all too often, are in that this is a preview, and, oh, I don't like this, so I'm not going to play it. And it's like, this isn't even the game yet. And I think part of that is, even though like the playtest materials that they're giving out are beautiful and wonderfully made, it's almost like they give the wrong impression, right? It's kind of funny. If they looked a little more thrown together, people would take them less seriously as this is a final product. But because they're piezo and they don't know how to do anything that doesn't look beautiful, everything is laid out very nicely. There's some organization problems, obviously, but just in terms of their 2-column format and the background art and how it all goes together, it looks polished, it looks finished, and that makes people say, oh, well, this is the finished product then, when it's not. The other thing I would say to the audience is that if you really want to see what Pathfinder 2 looks like, and you don't want a rigorous scientific playtest experience, try the scenarios, the Pathfinder Society scenarios that were released. There's, I believe, 1 at level 1 and 2 at level 5, plus some level 1 quests. So you've got plenty of things to play, and those are all written far much more like, this is a scenario for fun. It just happens to be using the Pathfinder 2 rules, and I found those to be really enjoyable.
And we haven't announced this officially yet, but John and Linda are joining us next week to talk about the Pathfinder Society scenarios, and specifically how, for all the different angles that there's negativity towards the playtest, everyone seems really happy with those Pathfinder scenario playtests. Those Pathfinder Society playtest scenarios.
Oh yeah, and Bard Wannabe mentioned there's a level 10 scenario, which I haven't had a chance to play, so now that's on my list of things to do.
Is that the Resonance-specific scenario? I believe there's one specific scenario that's either being written or rewritten to fully playtest a revision of Resonance.
Yeah, there's a Pathfinder Society one that was rewritten just to look at Resonance. And I expect that one, even though that is playtesting Resonance, to actually also be a fun adventure. Because I remember playing in the original one, and even though I had my character die, it was still a lot of fun. Bard Wannabe is saying no, that the 10th level scenario is a different one. So that's cool to know. So lots of options for playing the PFS stuff, which will give you a nice 4 to 5 hour game, and also, it's good episodic adventure, beginning, middle, and end, and get a better feel for what the system feels like in an actual adventure, and not in a playtest where they planned on a TPK, they just didn't tell you that.
There was allusion to it in the message early on, but I do think that there is still a lot of confusion about some of those messages, and they are addressed in this blog post that introduced the update 1.5. It's called Raising the Flag. It was posted on Monday, October 22nd, and it talks about how update 1.5 focuses on spells, which I believe they had plans to do, like, because we know that each section of Doomsday Dawn focuses on a different aspect of the game, and then a rules update tends to come shortly after the playtest period of that part. And so I have a feeling they scheduled this update is going to be about this, which is what we just playtested rigorously. And so one of the messages at the end of the blog here is that if we have not addressed your concern, it's not that we haven't heard it, it's that it's not time to address it yet. And I'm sure that Paizo is as frustrated with the feedback as some of the people that have been frustrated with the playtest are. But basically, Paizo had a plan, and we could see from the launch that this was a very structured, well thought out plan that had a lot of steps in advance already laid out. And so the fact that a lot more negativity was hit at early stages, I think, means that not only are they reacting to the negativity, but they also have all of these other plans that are now they're trying not to compromise those plans that they already had in place that they worked hard on, while staying ahead of the negativity that is, like I said, coming at them from all sides.
Yeah, because there are some, I know, like Jason Bowman was talking, for example, about the very tight math, and he also agrees that it might be too tight. I know that's one of my big complaints, is that the math is so tight that your D20 roll has much more impact on what happens than the build of your character. And he's like, yeah, we're aware of that, but to fix something like that now requires essentially a whole rewrite. So we are aware of the problem, but we can't fix it during the playtest because it's just far too much to re-release.
So it's interesting. I have almost that exact same answer in a quote here, but the question that was posed was about monster DCs. So the way it's phrased is monster DCs, how they rate to players, the tuning feels off. And the answer from the devs is, we are aware there is a math problem in the game. A significant element of that is we assumed a high degree of optimization that is normally reasonable. A solution to that is unlikely to show up in the playtest since it should be a large overhaul. But basically, we are aware of the problem, plan on having a solution for the final version, at least, which we will talk about probably after the playtest. So I do think that, like, yes, that's a response they're giving to a lot of different questions, but it's because most of the questions can be summed up as the math is a problem. And I mean, it's a role-playing game system, so the math is a major thing. And when they find and acknowledge that there's a math problem, it affects everything. It affects monster DC, it affects balance, it affects feeling like your choices matter. And so we're only going to get that after the playtest, or we're going to get serious talk about it after the playtest, because I guess they're still just trying to power through and get as much feedback about specific elements only tangentially related to the core problem of the system before they then can revamp everything.
Yeah, I think that's probably smart at this point, because, you know, they can't go back and just say, all right, well, here's another 500-page PDF that we revised the whole thing. So it makes sense to focus on what they can for now. But I'm just glad that they're acknowledging some of the issues that they're seeing. And in a way, it sort of makes sense to me that when they're originally going through their math for the initial release of the playtest, they think it looks good, but they also know the system so well that when they're calculating, like, well, how hard do I want it to be to accomplish this specific goal, right, to get a success at this specific task, they are doing the math and say, well, we want a 60% chance of success, so we'll figure out how we can be really good at that task, make it 60%, and then we're done. And then realize later, not everyone's optimized, and the result is people really have a 40% chance, and they feel like they're terrible at it.
Right. Like, if the assumption is that it's easy to get an 18 stat, everyone will want an 18 stat. And then you get people saying, like, I find 16 more interesting, or I want a bunch of 16s instead of one 18. And then it's like, having a bunch of 16s may make you think you should be good at a lot of things instead of great at one thing, but it actually means you're bad at everything.
Right.
So there is another quote. I don't have it written down here. Shoot, and I've actually just lost it. It was in reaction to something you were just saying. Oh, yeah, about the language. So I know that they were also saying that 2E was written a lot more gamey, that it was a lot more, we are putting the game terms first, we're making sure the game terms are consistent, we're making sure everything is, and by we, I mean Paizo, I'm not quoting them, but I'm taking it from their point of view. There we go. So yeah, they wanted to make sure that there's fewer issues with interpretation by making sure that the language is a lot more structured. And that is alienating to people. Like, there are more issues with interpretation because people are less engaged because it is less flavorful language. And it is not saying like, hey, imagine you are in this scenario, so you would be using these terms in character. Instead, it's focusing on the stuff that it was always problematic in first edition, where it's like, this guy says he has a +1 sword, but what does +1 mean to him in the world? Well, now suddenly the whole world is more in math terms and is not in terms that your characters would be using. And so it's people responded a lot more negatively to that than the devs anticipated. So not only are they working the math, they also have to rewrite the entire rulebook to reflect a preference for how the language is used. All not anticipated in the timeline that they were laid out.
And I can kind of see how they got there. That's actually not a problem that bothers me as much. But then again, I've spent so much time in organized play where those weird little rules things on how they worded something all of a sudden becomes the most important thing. Because how you interpret it, something that's not clear, is either all the PCs live or they all die. And as a GM, you go, well, I guess you all live because I don't want to TPK your table, even though I don't agree with that ruling. But whatever, we'll move on. And it's like, if that vagueness wasn't there, that would be easier to run from an organized play perspective. But on the other hand, when it's really technical like that, it does feel like you're reading like a video game manual on how to optimize your World of Warcraft build, and not, I'm playing this cool role-playing game with interesting world and fun characters. So I can understand that feedback, but I can also understand why the devs would have written a more technical version. You just have to look through the pages and pages of FAQs that they've gotten over the year and say, we wrote things more clearly. We wouldn't have to have pages of FAQs.
Right. So I do think that a lot of second edition choices were greasing a lot of squeaky wheels. And now people are stepping forward and saying the reason Pathfinder is so popular and we're still playing it is because those problems are only a problem to a fraction of your fan base.
True.
And by favoring that fan base, you're now causing a problem for the majority of your fan base, or at least
another large chunk.
The reason that I feel comfortable saying the majority is because John Brazer Enterprises, which is a third-party publisher, just posted their Facebook just a very informal poll saying, do you plan on sticking to first edition or going to second edition? And there's like over 50 comments on it, and the majority of them are, we're sticking to first edition. Now, one thing about that is that this is a third-party publisher, so the people that are fans of that page are going to be the kind of people that have bought more Pathfinder material than most people, because they bought everything Paizo has to offer, and now they've gone to other people that are selling them things. So true. I think that they are a little more financially invested, so it doesn't reflect the majority of the Pathfinder fan base, but at least it was a scary number of people that were like, no, 2E's not for me.
Yeah.
And if one of the goals of making 2E sound more technical was just so that people can look at 1E and 2E as both viable options and to make 2E a distinct game, it does mean that it's now actually competing with first edition instead of trying to take what first edition did great and just revise it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I'm hoping that even though it's a lot of work to rewrite that language, that by just smoothing out some of the language, not necessarily to be more vague, just to be more appealing, honestly, and to read less technically, that they can sort of help bring people back in. And I think a lot of the rule changes they're doing might do that as well. I'm curious to see what happens next August, if they release on time and what that looks like and what the reception of the game is once it's finally in print. So...
Yeah, I want to say that I do often come off very negative when I'm talking about second edition, and it's a combination of this game in its current presentation really does not appeal to me as much as first edition did, and I'm just trying to keep a finger on the pulse, but I'm also trying to use vague terms as much as possible because I don't have hard data.
Sure.
But I also want to really, like, the dev team has my sympathy, so even though as the player it's like, I want this system to be the best possible system, and I am super like I am super invested in Pathfinder as a thing, and so I want to talk passionately about it. But I also understand the position they're in, and I do kind of feel guilty anytime I talk particularly negatively about second edition. I haven't written it off yet. I think there's still potential, and I think that it's unfortunate from my point of view as a player that they have to play certain things so close to the vest, because I would love just a little more reassurance that some of my major problems are going to be addressed. And like one, I can't feel catered to. There is much more people in this hobby than just me. And two is that I understand why they are not saying it right now. It's just also frustrating that they're not saying it right now. It's a very interesting time to be a Pathfinder player or a Pathfinder enthusiast.
Yeah, I know for me, like, I'm still very excited about Pathfinder 2. I still think it can be a fantastic system. As someone who likes to write, player options as well, I'm excited about the things that can be done with those. The way they've structured the game actually opens up a lot of design space that makes it more accessible. For example, if I want a cool feat, I don't have to have a whole tree. I just say it's a level 8 feat, and then I'm done with it. And that's kind of neat. So I like a lot of these bits of potential. 3-action economy and what you can do with that from the design space is fantastic. But, I have my concerns like anyone else about the balance and all that and the flow of the game. But I also am hearing, I think, for me anyway, all the right things from the development team that, like the too tight math and stuff like that, the monster DCs that are too high, that they know that, like, yeah, okay, these are problems and we'll fix them. Gives me hope anyway that in the final game these will be addressed, and that it'll be not only some of these neat options that I can design around and play with, but just a really great fun to play game overall. So I don't know, I'm still confident, I'm still optimistic.
I saw somebody on a Facebook a TUI fan page, so not Paizo affiliated, saying that Paizo was I believe the quote was they were making the same mistake that Wizards of the Coast made with 4th edition. And while I can see similarities between the 4th edition system and the Pathfinder 2nd edition system, I think that there is so much that happened with the 4th edition launch. Like, first of all, it launched by talking down the old system and also replacing 3rd edition, which just made people very defensive. Whereas Paizo has said repeatedly, we're just going to keep 1st edition in print. As long as people are buying it, we're still selling it. So people don't have to be mad at Paizo for replacing the game they love, because the game they love is still there.
Sure.
But also, Wizards of the Coast almost immediately rebooted their campaign settings. And so if you were the kind of person that you would play Dungeons & Dragons, any system, you just loved the worlds, they destroyed the worlds. And so that's not something that's happening with Paizo. Galarian is still intact, and really the only noticeable change is that suddenly the economy is based on silver pieces instead of gold pieces. Otherwise, it's just another year for Galarian, even though it's one of the biggest years in Paizo's history as a company. Oh, Dungeon Novice mentions third-party stuff. That's true. Third-party publishing, like, there was a massive confusion when 4th edition was launched about how third-party support was going to work, to the point that it forced Paizo's hand to create Pathfinder. 4th edition was launched with this talk of this virtual gaming table being a major feature, and it was not available at launch for a whole bunch of weird and complicated reasons that are not Wizards of the Coast's fault. But still, like, to say 2E and 2E Pathfinder and 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons have some mechanical similarities, fine. But to say that the launch is at all similar to how 4th edition launched is really underestimating just how many things went wrong with that launch.
Yeah, I think cutting out third-party support was a major mistake, and one of the things that led to the downfall of 4th edition. I know I played it, and it was a fun system, but I also know that a lot of folks who want a million options often turn to third-party support. And when all of a sudden, as you said, third-party support can't write legally for 4th edition anymore, Paizo took up that gambit and said, sure, all right, well, we'll just keep writing for the system. And that might be something that happens with Pathfinder 1 and 2, and you get a split. It's potentially what might happen. I don't think that's a horrible thing, because as Paizo has already said, that means you'll still be buying our cool rulebooks, and sure, we still like Pathfinder 1, we just want to do something new and different. So I think it'll be okay. One of the things Bard Wannabe mentioned was that the PFS campaign is ending and going to the new system, and that's pretty huge, and it's true. But I know in every area is different, but in our area, we still have plans to keep running Pathfinder 1 because we still have new players who are coming in all the time who haven't played the last 10 years worth of scenarios. And so that just means we're probably going to go to a much more focused, almost campaign-based mode with Pathfinder 1, where we just do a big Black Rose arc one year and then a big, something else one year. And revisit all those stories because there's still plenty of things to play that people haven't touched. So I don't know. I think it'll still be around.
Not to mention adventure paths have been sanctioned for Pathfinder. Even if you've been playing Pathfinder since the alpha of the first edition, you have not played all of the Pathfinder content. So if you are a Pathfinder 1E enthusiast, you will have plenty of content to go for years to come, and you'll be able to go meet up with someone that may have transitioned to second edition and say hey, I just played Serpent Skull. And then you can have the joint experience of we've both played this chunk of Pathfinder lore, this chunk of Pathfinder content, and you can have that shared experience, which is what being in this fandom is all about. So even if the core rules you're playing with are different, you can still find common ground.
Oh, absolutely. And like you were saying, there's so many adventure paths out there that even if you got together with a group that have been playing different things, you can still probably find an adventure path, probably several that no one's played, that you can pick up and say, well, we kind of skipped over Giant Slayer, so let's go back and play that. That sounds cool. And you can keep playing it for years because there's so much content out there. So
now, Bard Wannabe is saying that his area has mostly gone through most of the PFS content. Bard Wannabe, I hope you're here for the next episode when I talk to John and Linda, because it is PFS focused. So you can definitely, your questions will be valuable to me because I believe Param's actually in a similar situation to you where a lot of people in his area have played it all. That's not my situation. So having you in the audience next week or in 2 weeks will be valuable, Bard. Well, not Bard Wannabe. Believe it or not, Vanessa, at some point I was bringing up the 4th edition launch as a transition to talk about the new Kickstarter.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and then I got completely derailed because that is a deep dive.
Okay.
So let's scale it back and say that, hey,
sure.
If you're a fan of Pathfinder, you might be a fan of the Iconics, and you might be a fan of this new Kickstarter for a Seone statue.
Oh, I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, so this was hinted at PaizoCon by, if it wasn't hinted at by Mark Moreland, then at least Mark Moreland's name was associated with it. But Dynamite Entertainment is both the publisher of the Pathfinder comic. Oh, Russ Brown is asking Kickstarter, so here's a link. Yeah, so they published the Pathfinder comic, but they are a multimedia entertainment company, so they also do things like licensed statues. And so they have launched a Kickstarter for a Pathfinder limited edition statue. This is the first resin statue for Pathfinder, and they've chosen Seone as the subject. And it is a very short run. It is a 14-day campaign. So you may look at it and say, oh, they haven't hit their goal yet. I don't know if it's going well. They're actually on day 2 or day 3 of this campaign.
Oh, wow.
And they're about halfway to their goal.
Yeah.
So they're doing okay. It hasn't funded yet, but it still definitely has the potential to. Have you had a chance to look at the Seone limited edition statue Kickstarter?
I was just looking at it while you were talking about it, and that looks like a really beautiful sculpt if that's what it's going to look like. So, yeah, that's really cool. For collectors and all that.
I am happy that it captures Seone. Like, she looks powerful, she looks cool, and it captures her design, which can be cheesecakey, and they completely avoided that. It's just like she's showing as much skin as her design shows the skin, but they are not like emphasizing that too much. It's a cool statue on its own without being like overly sexualized.
I mean, there are still lots of the skin showing that it usually shows, but I think that they didn't over embellish. I might have picked a different character just because of the sort of controversy around her outfit. But it still looks like a good sculpt. It's a nice action pose, so.
It is a 12-inch statue, which means it's 1/6 scale. And something fun that they're doing is that I can actually swap out her accessories. So cool. The one in the default image has her casting a spell, and I really like that spell casting effect. And then she's holding her, her familiar staff in the other hand. But there is also a staff in her left hand and, appropriately enough, a dagger for her right hand.
Always have a dagger.
And I guess if you really wanted to, I think you can. Oh, I don't know if that is one staff that goes through a hand with a hole in it, or if it's two sculpted staffs. So I guess you could potentially have a dual wielding sorcerer.
Oh yeah, I guess you could. Well, it looks like it's a whole different hand, because there's the hand that holds the magic spell being cast, and there's a hand that holds a staff. So it might just be that the whole hand comes out.
So the tattoo work is definitely impressive.
Oh yes,
and it's very evocative of what we're used to. Or actually also the detailing on her robes. Like this is a statue that the more you look at it, the more you see, which is very cool.
Yeah, I even like, there's a dirt and scratches paint detailing that they show, where it's like there's some smudges of dirt on her face and her shoulder. There's sort of dirt down near the bottom of her, I want to call them robes, that, looks like they've been tracked around the mud a little bit, and it kind of gives it a nice lived-in, realistic feel from that aspect. It's pretty cool.
So now a couple of other things you can get from this Kickstarter. You can get the black or the unpainted version if you are someone that would prefer to paint your own statue. Oh, hey, there's a section that says, oh no, it says who is Seone. I thought it was a why Seone section for a second there. Additional add-ons. You can get a t-shirt of the Pathfinder comic cover with the Jaws parody, where instead of a shark, it's the goblin.
That's a good one.
You can get Sandpoint Light of the Lost Coast, the Pathfinder campaign setting book. It's signed by James Jacobs. And then you can get the entire Pathfinder graphic novel library. And I just want to reiterate, because I think it's been a little while since we've reviewed any of the Pathfinder comics. I love the Pathfinder comics. I think they are super fun. They are really they really dive into the world. The adventures are interesting. Honestly, the only series I don't recommend is the Goblin series. I just thought it kind of missed the mark. And I guess Worldscape is a little bit of a deep cut. But otherwise, like even Worldscape, it's basically Secret Wars, but for Pathfinder and a bunch of Dynamite's other properties.
Sure.
But it does still, the bookends advance some of the meta plot that's going on. And yeah, it's a nice pace. It's a nice adventure. It's got a nice variety of everything we've been talking about, the setting, the themes. And honestly, the Spiral of Bones, the most recent one, the one written by Crystal, might be the best one yet. And it is very Valeros focused and very different in pace and presentation from all of the other ones.
Yeah, I really want to read that one. I'm actually looking through the list they have at the bottom of the Kickstarter, and I didn't realize there were so many series. I think I've read Dark Waters Rising and part of Tooth and Claw. But I didn't realize they had so many. I'm going to have to get out there and read some of these, because I really enjoyed what I wrote, what I had read. And I remember the interview with Crystal making Spiral of Bones just sound amazing. So that's definitely on my to-read list. Yeah,
Spiral of Bones is amazing. Origins is fun in that it brings in a lot of the other iconics, but it also is the first time that it's not written by Jim Zub. So first of all, there's a tone shift there. And second of all, it's written by Eric Mona, F. Wesley Snyder, and James Sutter. All people very familiar with Pathfinder, all excellent writers, but comics are a specific medium, and there's a bit of a growing pain there. So once you get past Origins, which, again, is entertaining on its own, it's just, if Origins had been the first book, it would be a little bit rough around the edges, and people might have dismissed this entire line as like, oh, it's tie-in fiction. But yeah, because it started with the Jim Zub, the three miniseries by Jim Zub, Origins was a little bit more forgivable as a transition point, and from then on, it's just been up and up. Yeah. Which is not to say the Jim Zub stuff was the low point either. It started strong and it's still strong. I love these comics so much.
Apparently. I know, now you're inspiring me to want to go read all these comics, so I'm going to have to go get that done.
I recommend them, and you can get, I believe they're all collected, so if you just want to get the trade paperbacks, that's also an option for you. Or, if you're back in the statue, you can get them as an add-on.
That's cool.
The last backer level is a create your own miniatures level. Yeah, it's create your own miniatures. Oh yeah, because you get 10 metal miniatures for your personal campaigns of a single design. It's $1,200.
Wow.
I mean, this is something that Reaper used to do like twice a year. You could have input into a miniature, and those were always like for charity events and whatnot. So it's a hefty price tag, but we're in a post-Hero Forge world, so I don't know exactly. It's just such a strange thing thrown in at the end of this Kickstarter that has nothing to do with miniatures.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, you get 10 of them, so it's only $120 each.
Maybe they're thinking, we're super good at digital sculpting people, and we have the 3D printing technology, so sure, I guess that can be a backer reward.
Well, it is.
But I don't know about $1,200. That's... Whew.
Yeah, it's a head scratcher for a couple of reasons. One, it's very expensive,
Mm-hmm.
and two, it's tangential to the rest of the campaign.
It really is.
But other than that, I think that this is a really fun Kickstarter, and I haven't backed it yet. I'm not sure if I want the statue, and I don't really need any of the other add-ons because I have all the comics. But I do hope it succeeds because it would be cool to see some of the other ones that they develop.
Mm-hmm. That'd be cool.
Oh, man. I was going to say, I'm not the biggest Seoni fan, but no, the comics really make Seoni cool. You were saying that it wouldn't be the first character you would have gone with. Who would you have gone with as the first iconic for a statue?
Well, I think they wanted to go with one of the core iconics for classic reasons. I probably would have gone with Mauricio, just because she does have a lot going on in her outfit. She's fully clothed. She is just a really kick-ass and also interesting character that I think they would have had a lot of options there. You know, even the swap out equipment, right? Does she have a dagger, rapier? What's she doing? Even throw some other stuff in there. If they wanted to go with a newer one, I also think that, who's I thinking? Marvola? That's Tom Riddle. The Occultist.
Oh, yeah.
That guy.
Anyway, continue.
He just has a really interesting design because of the nature of occultists have all of those different objects around them, objects of power, that they would have a really interesting statue with a lot of detail. So I think he would also have made a pretty good choice. And Bard Wannabe, we're not calling him that.
Mavaro,
that's right. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, so every time I try to think of it, my brain loads Malvolio, and that's not it. Mavaro. Yeah, I think Mavaro would have been a really cool choice too.
Really? I think that's pretty left field. I don't know how much of a following this character has. You justified why you picked it.
I guess so.
Of the what are there, 40 iconics now?
I don't know. Freya looks cool. There's a lot of that. I don't know, have really interesting, cool designs that are less hotly contested as Seoni.
Sure.
So. But I think Mauricio would have been my go-to choice, honestly.
Yeah, I think Mauricio could have had this similar appeal to what Seoni is, that side of the Seoni character design appeal.
Yeah.
You would have still been, selling to that audience without this being the first impression that people who might not know Pathfinder see as a Pathfinder statue.
Exactly. And they don't go, oh, it's more cheesecake fantasy. They're like, oh, wait, no, there's an interesting dynamic character. So.
I'm still kind of surprised this is a Kickstarter for a single statue. If it had been the four, maybe not Ezrin. Yeah, I guess we'd have to say Ezrin. Nah, Kira. So if it was Kira, Mauricio, Seoni, Valeros, and what is the Alchemist Goblin's name?
Alchemist Goblin. Oh,
second edition Goblin. Flumbus. There we go.
Flumbus.
I think that would have been a good selection if they had gone with more than one character. And I'm only saying that because I have a hard time narrowing down to just the one character that encompasses all of Pathfinder. I'm leaning towards Valeros.
He's been sort of their standout, yeah.
Yeah, and especially because City of...
Spiral of Bones?
Spiral of Bones, that's right.
Yeah.
I was like, City of Bones, isn't right? City of Spirals? Yeah, Spiral of Bones is a Valeros-centric story, so because it's dynamite, it makes a little bit more sense.
Sure.
Oh, it's Fumbus, not Flumbus.
Fumbus.
Thank you, Russ.
Russ to the rescue.
Is there any other news that you're aware of, Vanessa? Because those are the two items on my list.
No other news per se.
All right, then I think we're ready to wrap things up right after this. Wrap-ups and shout-outs. Wrap-ups and shout-outs. Wrap-ups. Wrap-ups and shout-outs. Thank you for joining us for episode 187 of No Direction, the Pathfinder News, Reviews, and Interviews podcast. Before we go, we have an opportunity to shout out to anything, absolutely anything at all. Vanessa, is there anything you want to bring people's attention to?
One thing that I'm really excited about that I'm working on right now that I get to talk about is a product from Legendary Games. Excuse me. From Legendary Games. They're doing the Alien Codex, which has all sorts of wonderful space-themed things in it. And they are releasing that for, I think, the Starfinder and 5e. I guess the Pathfinder one's already out there. I'm working on the Starfinder one, and it's looking really good, the content that's in there. So I'm working on that, and it's so much fun to work on, and it's going to be a really cool product. So if you're a Starfinder player who needs more space stuff, this will be a goldmine.
Where do you find the time? Like, you've got system mastery of multiple different systems. You're doing all kinds of second edition stuff. I'm impressed.
Google Calendar, scheduling it all.
Nice.
I also want to just shout out there something the network's doing, which is the Yuletide Terror actual play. I get to do all the tech for that, which is why I was set up for this today.
You get to.
I get to. Well, it's fun. It's going to be a really good adventure. We've got, I get to be DJ and play creepy music. And that's being run by Alex Agunis. And then we have Luis Loza and Param is playing in it, as well as special guest star Jason Keeley are all playing in it. And it's going to be a lot of fun. And we're aiming for Sunday. So if you're not doing anything, Sunday from 2 to 7, come back to this Twitch TV channel and watch them play some amazing horror holiday adventure.
From now on, I'll think of you as DJ Creepy Music.
Oh, wonderful. I'm glad I got that in your head.
I'm going to shout out to something a little different. Netflix has a new series called The Dragon Prince. I guess it's about a month old now. I originally checked it out because my friend Omari does a voice in one of the episodes. But having now watched the whole 9 episodes of the first season, or at least the first, whatever's been released, the 9 episodes they've released, it's very much a role-playing game brought to life. And the dialogue is a kind of like, every now and then it throws in a pop culture reference that makes no sense to be in this world. And I would be shocked if the writers of the show weren't intentionally trying to create a tabletop role-playing game as a serious cartoon. Not that it's super serious. I mean, it's fun. It's got great lore. The first episode does take a lot of it takes a little more getting used to than the rest of them, because it dives into the whole lore of the world, who these characters are, establishes the tone, everything, once again, that we talked about earlier makes a good adventure, is also the core of a series. And the first episode carries a lot of the weight of establishing a lot of specific elements that really flavor the rest of the series. Okay. But I enjoyed it, and I'm kind of bummed that I have to wait an unknown amount of time before I get to see episode 10 and beyond.
Oh, I see. Well, cool. I'm going to have to put that in my queue.
Dungeon Novice in chat says he thinks of most every show like it could be an RPG system or game.
Yeah, I know my wife sometimes when we're watching things, and I'm like, oh, game term. And she's just like, you are such a nerd. Yes, I am. You know I am.
We had someone on the old Private Sanctuary forums. What's his name? MedTech? Anyway, do you remember, there was a major flood in New York 7 or 8 years ago, and he was there, and he was a first responder during it. And one of the first things he did when he got internet back was post saying, you know what, we need better rules for environmental stuff in, I don't know if it was Pathfinder or 3.5 at the time. And I was like, I really admire that when you are faced with a life or death situation and floods all around, you're still thinking about how you would incorporate this into a game.
The flood rules are not extreme enough. We need to write those to show the horror that it is. It's funny.
All right. Well, thank you once again for joining us, Vanessa. You've really, you were an excellent replacement co-host and producer, all with effectively zero notice on both of those things, while also being a very entertaining guest, very informative. And you did the network proud with your presence tonight.
Oh, thanks.
Where can people find out more about you?
Oh, I'd like to say my website, but it's not being built because I'm too busy doing other stuff.
Tell them about our website.
But you can go to our website. So I've got a bio on there. And you can read all my fun craft adventure blog stuff, which goes into all sorts of my advice on writing adventures, and a bunch of other really useful, cool blogs. So that is one place. Or my Paizo profile has a big list of a lot of my published work. So those are two places for now.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Ryan Costello, and if you want to find the path, you need no direction. All right. You can